This hearing will now come to order. This hearing of the House Foreign Affairs Committee is on examining nuclear negotiations. Iran after Rouhani's first 100 days. We're going to evaluate the current state of nuclear diplomacy with Iran, and of course last week, world powers and Iran held a second round of negotiations in Geneva. These are historical talks with a potentially profound impact on the national security interests of the United States. The administration is looking to negotiate an interim agreement in which Iran commits to placing some limits on its nuclear program for 6 months in exchange for immediate and significant sanctions relief, with reportedly as much as $50 billion in frozen oil revenues being released as part of the agreement. This deal was not reached in Switzerland. Some U.S. allies believed the Iranian commitment was insufficient. Of great concern, the proposal failed to adequately address Iran's heavy water reactor. The proposal also, members, would allow Iran to continue to enrich uranium and would allow Iran to continue to build centrifuges. The French foreign minister warned of a fool's game, in his words. There is growing concern in Congress that the outlines of this agreement do not meet the standards needed to protect the United States and to protect U.S. allies. Central to these talks is the issue of uranium enrichment and reprocessing. These technologies can produce the explosive material needed for a nuclear weapon. Indeed, that is why Iran wants the capability. And that's why multiple UN Security Council resolutions have reiterated one demand, and that demand is that all of Iran's enrichment activities, regardless of their purpose, must be suspended. On this question, the world has spoken decisively, but the administration envisions permitting Iran to enrich to low levels. Regardless of the name, low-enriched uranium and medium-enriched uranium are close to weapons-grade highly enriched uranium. That's because the effort needed to produce weapons material eases as you advance. Non-proliferation experts tell us that while medium-enriched uranium is nearly weapons-grade, low-enriched uranium still represents 7/10 of the effort to get to weapons-grade. Of course, Iran continues to assert that the Non-Proliferation Treaty grants it the so-called right to pursue these dangerous technologies. We must remember, and I would suggest we must insist, that the treaty was designed to stop the proliferation of nuclear weapons. Simply because a nuclear activity can be used for peaceful purposes does not mean that the NPT's members have an unconditional right to pursue or acquire it, let alone a country that has actively deceived the international community and violated its International Atomic Energy Agency nuclear safeguard agreements. Iran can have peaceful energy, peaceful nuclear energy, but not with the access to technology that could be used to advance a weapons program. There is the question of sanctions, which have been painstakingly developed by Congress over many, many years. Sanctions have battered the Iranian economy not just because of their depth, not just because of the breadth of the sanctions, but because of the market forces at play. International companies seeking to avoid their web, the web of sanctions, steer clear of Iran. As one witness has written, Iran's sanctions have been as much psychological as legal. The easing of sanctions, no matter how minor they may seem, and the Geneva sanctions relief was not minor, the easing of those sanctions could deflate these forces, eliminate our leverage, and indeed remove the reason $600 billion in capital flight out of the country, the very reason that Iran is at the table today. Sanctions have forced Iran to the table. We should build upon this success with additional measures like those now pending in the Senate to compel Iran to make meaningful and lasting concessions. The Iranian regime hasn't paused its nuclear program. Why should we pause our sanctions efforts, as the administration is pressuring Congress to do? Only when the Iranian regime is forced to decide between economic collapse or compromise on its rush to develop a nuclear weapons capability do we have a chance to avoid that terrible outcome. I'll now turn to the ranking member for any opening comments he may have. Mr. Engel of New York.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank you for holding this important hearing and to welcome all of our witnesses here this morning. I look forward to hearing their testimony. In late September, Chairman Royce and I wrote an op-ed about Iran's new president, Hassan Rouhani. We were curious if, beyond the charm offensive and gentle smile, he would use his first 100 days in office to attempt to fundamentally change the direction of the Iranian government and demonstrate a genuine willingness to end Iran's nuclear weapons program. The chairman and I wrote this op-ed piece together because we thought it was important to show a congressional unity in such an important issue as Iran. Now, after Rouhani's first 105 days in office, it's clear to me that Iran still poses a significant threat to the United States and to our allies. Iran remains the world's top state sponsor of terrorism and continues to support Hezbollah. They are actively supporting the Assad regime in Syria, which has slaughtered tens of thousands of innocent civilians, and they are working to destabilize our allies in the Gulf. But the biggest threat so far, by far, is Iran's continuing effort to develop a nuclear weapons capability. Many experts believe that Iran is approximately 1 year away, or maybe even less, from acquiring this capability, and we must do everything possible to prevent that from happening. The successive sanctions bills crafted by this committee and signed into law by President Obama, taken together with international sanctions, have had a devastating impact on Iran's economy. Iran is having trouble selling its oil on the global markets, has been cut off from the international financial system, and is starved for hard currency. This intense pressure brought Iran back to the negotiating table, and this pressure must be maintained and strengthened if necessary until Iran has taken verifiable steps to freeze and even dismantle its nuclear weapons program. The Iranians are masters at negotiation for the sake of buying time. We must remember that Rouhani formerly served as Iran's chief nuclear negotiator, and he has bragged about deceiving the West in previous negotiations. Now, some people say he's a reformer. I don't believe he's a reformer because no reformers were allowed to run for president. He may be the most moderate of all the hardliners that were allowed to run, but he's no reformer. The reformers were all eliminated. And it's not clear to me that even if he decided or desired to do so, that he would be able to take Iran into a new direction. It appears to me that the supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, still has the power, and so we really just don't know where we're going. So while we must have a genuine openness to a diplomatic process that resolves all outstanding issues, we must judge Iran by its actions, not by any rhetoric that we might hear. And by the way, the rhetoric that Rouhani came back to Tehran and spoke to the Iranian parliament, his rhetoric was hardline and not much different from what we've heard over the past several years. About 4 weeks ago, the Iranians came to Geneva, which what some thought appeared to be a new attitude. For the first time, they admitted that the sanctions were hurting them badly. And for the first time, they started talking about the specifics of an agreement. Since that initial meeting, technical experts from the P5+1 have met with their Iranian counterparts to discuss the contours of a possible deal. And at the end of last week, another key meeting took place at the ministerial level. Much has been reported in the press about this latest meeting, the offer that was left on the table, and the reactions of Iran and the P5+1. Let's be clear. None of us here today were at the negotiating table, and as far as I know, none of us have yet been briefed on the details. So I think it would be wise for all of us to speak with some degree of caution until all the facts are known. But having said that, I'm deeply troubled by reports that the proposed agreement would not have required Tehran to stop all enrichment. If Iran intends to show good faith during these talks, I believe it must, at a minimum, abide by United Nations Security Council resolutions calling for a halt to enrichment, and it is my hope that we achieve much more. In addition, I forcefully reject any notion that Iran has a right to enrichment, and that's the position the administration has publicly supported on numerous occasions. The bottom line for me is this. If these talks are about Iran abandoning its nuclear program, then to show good faith, at the very least while the talks are going on, Iran should stop enrichment, period. Given the failure to reach an agreement in Geneva, I believe it's time for my colleagues in the Senate to take up the Iran sanctions legislation that I co-authored with Chairman Royce, and which the House passed overwhelmingly this summer. We must make it crystal clear to Iran that even tougher sanctions are coming down the pike if the regime is unwilling to take concrete and verifiable steps to freeze and then dismantle its nuclear weapons program. I know as Secretary of State has a profound interest in the legislation Congress is considering on Iran. I hope the administration understands that we cannot take their concerns fully into account, nor truly understand events at the negotiation table, or grasp the impact our legislation may have on their efforts if they do not do a better job of keeping Congress informed and taking into account what Congress thinks. I support the President's effort to engage Iran and believe we must continue to explore every diplomatic option to resolve this crisis. Nobody wants another conflict in the Middle East, but we must also recognize the fact that Iran is getting closer and closer to a nuclear weapons capability with each passing day. There is still time to test Iran's intentions, but that time is growing short. So, Mr. Chairman, thank you again for holding this hearing. I look forward to hearing the suggestions from our witnesses about the next best steps to take to tackle this difficult problem.
Thank you, Mr. Engel. We go now to the chair of the Middle East Subcommittee, Ileana Ros-Lehtinen of Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
1 minute.
As we know, in September, Secretary Kerry said that a bad deal is worse than no deal on the Iranian nuclear negotiations. Yet now, reports indicate that the administration was willing to offer Iran limited sanctions relief in return for a 6-month pause to only some of its nuclear program. The administration has seemingly acquiesced to the idea of a nuclear-armed Iran and has failed to learn from past negotiations with that rogue regime. We must not accept Iran's false claim to the right of enrichment, nor should we offer to ease any sanctions on this murderous regime. Iran would be able to quickly start up its enrichment program due to its advanced centrifuges without irreparably harming its objectives. But if we step back on our sanctions, it will be extremely hard to reinstate them. There must be no deal that does not include a full and verifiable dismantling of all of Iran's nuclear facilities, and until Iran is ready to accept those terms, we must continue to increase the pressure by fully implementing sanctions on the books and enacting even stricter sanctions. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Ted Deutsch of Florida is ranking member of the Middle East Subcommittee.
Thank you, Chairman Royce and Ranking Member Engel, for calling this hearing. Let me be absolutely clear. The international community cannot permit Iran to obtain nuclear weapons capability, and every option must remain on the table to ensure that it does not. This conflict will only end when Iran ends its effort to acquire nuclear weapons, and we can verify this action with full and total confidence. We know this Iranian regime has misled the international community for years, claiming only peaceful intentions while installing thousands of advanced centrifuges and building a heavy water reactor at Iraq. It's time to put Iran to the test. Any agreement, partial or full, should do this. Iran must immediately come clean about its entire nuclear program. Iran should respond to the evidence of its nuclear weapons program by granting immediate access to Parchin, the hidden military site that has yet to be open to international inspectors, and it should mothball Iraq, the heavy water plant that will accelerate the weapons program. With diplomatic talks resuming in 7 days, I urge our Senate colleagues to continue to advance new sanctions legislation. It is the crushing economic sanctions that force the Iranians on a march to the negotiating table. Tougher sanctions will not, as some have suggested, rule out a diplomatic resolution. They will strengthen our ability to get one that ends Iran's nuclear program. This regime must know exactly what is at stake if diplomacy fails. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Deutsch. We now go to Judge Ted Poe of Texas, Chairman of the Terrorism and Nonproliferation Subcommittee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Iran has technology in enriched uranium and is developing nuclear weapons with Israel and the United States in its sights. It seems the administration believes that appeasement and lessening sanctions will help negotiate a deal with Iran. When I met with Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu last week, he agreed with me that our sanctions are the only reason why Iran is at the table in the first place. He said this proposed deal was the worst deal of the century. I agree. What Iran wants is to ease the sanctions so that it can continue developing nuclear weapons without the pain of sanctions to its economy. Who'd thought that the French would save us from making a bum deal? The United States must be clear. There will be no reductions in sanctions without verified steps to show that Iran is abandoning its nuclear weapons program, not just a temporary freeze on development. Mr. Rouhani is a slick snake oil salesman. He puts his arm around the West and stabs us in the back at the same time. They cannot be trusted. No deal, Mr. Rouhani. I yield back.
Okay, Mr. Brad Sherman of California, Ranking Member of the Subcommittee on Terrorism and Nonproliferation.
Our sanctions program for the last 3 years is one of the very few things that our federal government's doing that works. It's one of the very few things that's bipartisan. That's why we need to do more of it, not less. And that's why the Senate should immediately pass the Nuclear Iran Prevention Act, which passed the House with 400 votes. An interim idea is a deal is a bad idea, because what the Iranians get eliminates the threat to regime survival by just reducing the sanctions enough to restore their economy. What we get is, at best, a few months' delay in when they have a nuclear weapon. They can restore their nuclear program at the end of the deal easily by flipping the switch. We will have a hard time reassembling other countries to impose strict sanctions when their businesses want to do business as usual. And $50 billion for them while they continue their plutonium enrichment plant at Iraq seems like a bad idea. It's time to declare that Iran has no right to enrich because it has violated the NPT, and it's time to move toward a final deal in which Iran gives up its centrifuges and imports its fuel just as Canada does, just as Sweden does, just as South Korea does. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Sherman. This morning, we're pleased to be joined by a distinguished panel of experts on Iran. Mr. Mark Dubowitz is the Executive Director of the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. He's an expert on sanctions and previously testified before the committee. He's advised the U.S. administration and numerous foreign governments on Iran sanctions issues. Before joining the American Enterprise Institute, Ms. Danielle Pletka served for 10 years as Senior Professional Staff Member for the Near East and South Asia on the U.S. Senate Committee on Foreign Relations. She is currently a Vice President of AEI. Mr. Colin Call is an Associate Professor at Georgetown University. He was previously the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for the Middle East at the Pentagon from 2009 to 2011, serving as Senior Policy Advisor to the Secretary of Defense. And without objection, the witness's full prepared statements will be made part of the record. The members here may have 5 days to submit statements or questions or extraneous material for the record. And we'll ask, of course, all our witnesses to summarize their testimony to 5 minutes as we have your written testimony in the record. We'll begin with you, Mr. Dubowitz.
Great. Well, thank you, Chairman Royce and Ranking Member Engel, members of the committee. Thank you very much for inviting me to testify to this committee, which really has done so much to enhance coercive diplomacy with Iran through sanctions. It's an honor to be here as well with Danny and with Colin. Regrettably, the proposed Geneva deal was not likely to keep Iran from developing a nuclear weapon. The French foreign minister rightly criticized the proposed agreement because it relaxed economic sanctions while only reining in the less important components of Iran's nuclear program. Now, this is not surprising. Over the years, no country has been more consistent than France in recognizing the Iranian regime's mendacity over its nuclear weapons ambitions. With talks set to resume on November 20th, lawmakers who want to encourage Western negotiators to cut a better deal now have an opportunity to do so by enacting more hard-hitting sanctions. What seems to have troubled the French about the negotiations, but reportedly nobody else in Geneva, was that the proposed deal would not have constrained Tehran's pathway to a plutonium bomb, and that not one piece of Iran's nuclear infrastructure would have been dismantled. Let's be clear, there was no freeze. Geneva reportedly also left significant loopholes for the Iranian regime to exploit during the 6-month period between an interim deal and a final deal. As just 2 examples, first, Iran would be permitted to continue to enrich uranium to 3.5%, adding almost another bomb's worth to its existing 3.5% stockpile of 5 to 6 bombs during that 6-month period. Now, this contravenes multiple Security Council resolutions that call for the immediate suspension of all enrichment. Second, Iran would be allowed to keep all of its installed centrifuges and produce thousands of additional ones without agreeing to the monitoring of any of its centrifuge manufacturing facilities. As a result, Iran could be well positioned to divert those centrifuges to secret enrichment facilities or to install them in its declared facilities at a time of its choosing. All of these nuclear facts on the ground would enhance Iranian leverage during negotiations for a final deal. We have seen this movie before, but it doesn't have to go this way. Now, without new sanctions, American negotiators will likely never again have as much economic leverage over Tehran as they do right now. The impact of European and American sanctions on Iran is what helped to jumpstart these negotiations. But to whatever extent the Supreme Leader fears popular unrest provoked by sanctions, that trepidation will lessen if economic pressure is relaxed. The efficacy of sanctions depends on the threat of their escalation, where an ever-expanding web of restrictions keeps foreign firms from doing business with the regime. In many ways, the Iranian sanctions program has been as much psychological as legal. So when the United States sends a signal that it's willing to block new sanctions and reduce existing sanctions for little in return, the impression abroad is that the White House's resolve is waning. The White House says new sanctions will undercut the sanctions coalition. Actually, the reverse is true. Without new escalating sanctions, the alternative is to rely on the enforcement of existing sanctions. This will invariably require the administration to punish many more companies than it has targeted in the past, including companies from its P5+1 allies. Now, reports out of Geneva indicate that the administration was ready to unfreeze assets, ease sanctions on gold, petrochemicals, the Iranian auto sector, give the regime tens of billions of dollars in hard currency. The regime would be allowed to take this hard currency back to Iran, giving Khamenei and Rouhani more cash to spend on nukes, terrorism, human rights abuses, or to support Assad. It is possible, though highly unlikely, that Rouhani, the right-hand man of former Iranian President Rafsanjani, who drove the nuclear program in the 80s and 90s, suddenly wants to forsake his nuclear legacy. But even if that were the case, why would the prospect of easing sanctions help him persuade Khamenei and the Revolutionary Guards to abandon their deeply held cause? The Geneva negotiations indicated that Rouhani's bosses are willing to make concessions that are easily revoked or are not much of a nuclear impediment to start with. We have the capacity to increase this pressure. New sanctions could be written to lock up all of Iran's overseas currency reserves. Financial relief should only come when Iran takes real steps to verifiably and irreversibly dismantle its military nuclear program. And there are ways to do this. We can discuss this more in the Q&A. Now, new sanctions may not be enough to stop an Iranian nuke, but America would have a much stronger hand in negotiations if Khamenei were put to a fundamental choice between economic collapse and his military nuclear program. Mr. Chairman, I argue here today that without new sanctions, we are currently at the high water mark of American negotiating leverage. If the Geneva proposal was as weak as our allies believed, what should make any of us think that a final agreement will be any better? Thank you very much.
Ms. Pletka.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Engel, members of the committee. It's always an honor to appear before House Foreign Affairs. Thank you very much for including me. I'm also honored to sit next to Colin and Mark, two people whose views I take very seriously on the Iran question. As we assess the current negotiations over Iran about its illicit nuclear weapons program and measure the efficacy of our sanctions, our overall Iran policy, and the quality of our negotiations themselves, a few things should be clear. We have rarely achieved anything of note in negotiations over such nuclear weapons programs, despite assiduous efforts to roll back, eliminate, neutralize, or otherwise alter the trajectory of programs in North Korea, in Pakistan, and India over the years. We failed in almost every case, bar one, and that was Libya, where Gaddafi's assumption of an imminent American military action forced him to relinquish most, although we now know not all, of his nuclear capabilities. We've also been fortunate in the nature of our adversaries. Only because the Islamic Republic has been so brazen, only because of its singularly incompetent leadership, only because of its catastrophic economic mismanagement, have sanctions actually begun to bite. In addition, successive presidents of the United States have consistently underused the authorities granted to them in law, both through IEPA and a series of Iran and proliferation-oriented pieces of legislation. Enforcement has depended far more on personality than on capacity. Congress, too, has proven itself more eager to draft legislation than it is to hold the administration's feet to the fire. And here I include both the Obama and the Bush and the Clinton administrations before it. I'm regularly struck by the willingness of committees of oversight to give a pass to State Department officials unwilling to enforce the letter of the law, and their lawyers who view sanctions-related determinations as optional instructions from the Congress. It's true every president should be eager to end the Iranian nuclear weapons program and stifle Tehran's attempts to dominate the Middle East. The question before us is simply on what terms. Unfortunately, those terms keep changing. In each new round of negotiations with Iran, the Obama administration has proffered a sweeter set of incentives and fewer demands of Tehran. That gives Iran every reason to play out the clock, advance its program, and hope for a better offer the next time around. In April of 2013, just this year, the P5+1 negotiating team demanded, among other measures, that Iran suspend all of its enrichment above 5% with Iran, and suspend all enrichment at the Fordow underground facility, and transfer all collected uranium ore, including enriched ore, to facilities within Iran. Previously, the P5 and its earlier iteration, the EU3 and the United States, demanded a suspension of all enrichment. Before that, the group demanded no enrichment at all and an end to the conversion of UF6 into precursors for enrichment. This time, the only suspension demanded is reportedly for 6 months, and there's no demand to transfer enriched fissile material internally, we understand from reports, although, as the ranking member says rightly, I don't think any of us have seen the actual proposal. When I asked an administration official about Parchin last week, which is the suspected site of nuclear weaponization activities, he responded that Parchin is the IAEA's problem, not the American negotiators' problem. Finally, on the question of how Iran will step back from its nuclear weapons program, we need to consider the strong possibility that Iran has secret nuclear sites. Indeed, the United States has not discovered any covert Iranian nuclear site until it was well advanced, and in most cases it was revealed by another party. I haven't spoken to a single official familiar with the intelligence from the U.S. or elsewhere who has denied that they suspect that Iran is operating a secret facility. Will additional sanctions persuade the Iranians of the need to end their program? Will strong actions from the Congress prevent the administration from demanding more of the Iranians? Yes and no. Only the strongest of sanctions have gotten Iran to the table. They have yet to agree to the de minimis demands of the Obama administration, let alone the more stringent ones of the United Nations and the IAEA. It's true, as my colleague said and as you said, that only tougher measures will keep them at the table. One final point. We've spoken today of Iran's nuclear program, though of course Iran also has a growing and sophisticated missile arsenal. In addition, the regime in Tehran is the prime engine of Assad's regime battlefield successes in Syria, the sole sponsor of Hezbollah, the world's most powerful terrorist group, a sponsor of Hamas, a spoiler in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Bahrain, in Yemen, and of course, an abuser of the Iranian people's own rights. Last, I just want to say a word about Rouhani, which is one of the topics of this hearing. The committee asked about the domestic and Iranian environment in which Rouhani finds himself. I believe actually that Rouhani is a reformer within the context that's allowed by the supreme leader. But his remit is to sustain the system that was put at risk by Ahmadinejad, not to give up the Iranian nuclear program. It's important to understand that his job is to set Iran on a stable footing, not to give up nuclear weapons or reconcile with the region. American officials who see themselves as key to Rouhani's credibility, as they've said, would be better served worrying about their own credibility. Their efforts to micromanage American domestic politics have been pretty unsuccessful. Efforts to manage Iran's are certain to fail. Thank you.
Dr. Call.
Chairman Royce, Ranking Member Engel, distinguished members of the committee, thank you for inviting me to testify. Danny, Mark, it's great to be at the table with you. The most recent round of talks between Iran and the P5+1 in Geneva were serious and sustained. Differences between the parties have been narrowed, bringing the broad contours of an interim agreement broadly into view. It's clear that several sticking points remain, and we do not know whether a deal will materialize on November 20th when the parties reconvene. But if it ultimately resembles the agreement described in recent press reports, it would be a meaningful first step on the road to a final comprehensive agreement. In the coming months, the opportunity to meaningfully constrain Iranian nuclearization could be seized, leading to a peaceful outcome, or squandered, setting the stage for an Iranian bomb, another military confrontation in the Middle East, or probably both. As a former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense, I firmly believe that all options need to remain on the table to prevent Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons. But I also know enough about how a military conflict with Iran would likely unfold to understand that an enduring diplomatic outcome is far preferable to another war in this part of the world. Achieving a peaceful solution will require close cooperation between the Obama administration and Congress. We have enough leverage at the moment to start the ball rolling towards a final agreement. More sanctions at this juncture are not required. According to U.S. intelligence officials, Iran has already mastered the basic knowledge and technology required to eventually produce nuclear weapons if the regime decides to do so. Nothing, including a complete dismantling of the Iranian program, will put that technological genie back into the bottle. Instead, negotiations should focus on a more concrete and achievable objective, which is placing meaningful and verifiable constraints on Iran's ability to translate rapidly its accumulated knowledge and civilian nuclear capabilities into nuclear weapons. That is, the deal we should be focusing on is one that would prevent an Iranian breakout capability. Some analysts argue that U.S. negotiators should capitalize on existing leverage created by crippling sanctions and Iran's apparent willingness to negotiate to insist on a maximalist deal. My colleagues at the table appear to share that view. This approach is reflected in Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu's 4 no's. No uranium enrichment at any level, ever. No stockpile of enriched uranium. No centrifuges or centrifuge facilities. And no Arak heavy water reactor. Attempting to keep Iran as far away from nuclear weapons as possible by making these demands seems reasonable. But in reality, the quest for an optimal deal that requires a permanent end to Iranian enrichment at any level would likely doom diplomacy, making the 2 worst outcomes, an Iranian bomb or a war with Iran, much more likely. Regardless of the pressure from the United States, the Iranian regime is simply unlikely to agree to permanently end all fuel cycle activities, including enrichment. Khamenei has invested far too much of the regime's domestic legitimacy and in an excess of $100 billion to defend Iran's so-called rights to find its domestic enrichment to completely capitulate now. Indeed, the Supreme Leader likely fears such a humiliation more than he fears escalating economic sanctions, economic collapse, or even targeted military strikes against his nuclear facilities. Given profound reasons for the regime to reject a maximalist deal, pursuing one would require the United States to go to the very brink of war with Iran to achieve it. It would also require a dramatic escalation of existing sanctions. Yet pursuing such a high-risk strategy is unlikely to work and could backfire badly. First, it is unclear whether any escalation of sanctions could bring the regime to its knees in time to prevent Iran from achieving a nuclear breakout. If the Iranian nuclear issue is as urgent as we all believe, that argues for having a deal sooner rather than later. Second, and somewhat paradoxically, escalating sanctions at this moment would actually end up weakening international pressure. Whether one believes Rouhani or not, he's changed the international narrative and made Iran look reasonable. If we start to look like the unreasonable party, it will make it much more difficult to sustain the international cooperation isolating Iran. Third, issuing more explicit military threats is also unlikely to achieve a maximalist diplomatic outcome, since targeted military strikes against Iran's program would not hold the regime at risk. And worse yet, signaling that our entire goal is to bring about an existential crisis for the regime would probably motivate them to accelerate their nuclear behavior to get a deterrent before that outcome materializes. So instead, we should be focusing on a sufficient deal that prevents breakout. The deal that the administration appears to be negotiating in Geneva would be a useful first step towards this outcome. It is not in and of itself the outcome. It is a first step towards this outcome. The broad contours of the deal have already been outlined by the other speakers, although I will say that the financial relief is not anywhere close to $50 billion. It is probably less than $10 billion. The question becomes whether in and of itself the first deal is a meaningful step, and the answer is yes in a number of respects. First of all, eliminating the 20% stockpile and stopping 20% enrichment would double the breakout time from its current level. That is, it would take Iran twice as long to produce weapons-grade material after this deal goes into place than is true today. That is meaningful. The deal would also put firm restrictions on building the fuel assemblies for the Arak nuclear reactor, which would also stop the clock on making that an unstoppable breakout capability for plutonium weapons. I can go into the other details about why the inspections regime and the rest of the details of the agreement are likely to serve U.S., Israeli, and other interests in whatever detail the committee members would like. Last but not least, just let me say something about sanctions. Because of your hard efforts and the efforts of the administration, we have accrued an enormous amount of leverage. Nothing in the limited sanctions relief under this deal guts the oil or financial sanctions which are required to drive the Iranians toward a final proposal. And nothing of it would be permanent if the Iranians reverse course. At this juncture, we have enough sanctions to get the Iranians across the goal line. The bigger risk is escalating sanctions at a very fragile moment of diplomacy and being responsible for diplomacy careening off the cliff. Thank you very much.
I remember well, before I go to my question, Ms. Pletka, I wasn't in Congress at the time, but I remember well the Reagan administration arguing as passionately against escalation of dramatic sanctions against South Africa that had the bomb. And I remember the consequence of members of Congress insisting that regardless of the fact that those sanctions might be debilitating, might create a certain crimp in our diplomacy with South Africa, the probable result, said Republicans and Democrats in the House and Senate at the time, was that we would bring South Africa to the table because it would be unendurable for the South Africans to continue both their efforts with apartheid as well as their ongoing efforts with their nuclear program. It turned out, in retrospect, that the members who passed that legislation in the House and Senate did have the legislation vetoed by the administration, but that veto was overridden by both houses, as I recall. And the consequences of it was that the government of South Africa, those involved in that process, said afterwards we wouldn't have lasted a week if we had not turned over the nuclear weapons program, if we had not turned over the bomb, and had we not changed from apartheid. I would just say that we've heard from the experts before in terms of the likely results, adverse results of dramatically increasing sanctions. But I was going to ask Danielle Pletka, Danny, what's your take on what happened with respect to our failure to do so with North Korea? Because I remember well, Treasury designed a program in 2005 to put sanctions on North Korea. We did it. State wanted them lifted, argued that if we lifted it, that we would get the results that were promised by the leader in North Korea at the time. And the consequences, of course, were very different than what was anticipated. We did not go through in that case with our full throttle sanctions. We lifted that, and what was the consequence?
I think North Korea has tested 3 times as a result of our fine negotiating efforts. And I want to remind the members who was involved with those negotiations efforts, because it was Wendy Sherman, the same person who we have in Geneva. There's another point here. There are 2 important points.
Point of personal privilege, no relation.
No accusation from me. There were 2 important points in what you said, I think. The first is about South Africa. The only time when these negotiations have succeeded is when governments change. So, for example, we've seen that some of the former states of the Soviet Union have also been willing to give up their nuclear programs, but it's only when the government is changed. It's not as a result of clever negotiations on the part of the United States or anyone else. The second point is how similar these discussions and the framework, which is being referred to casually as a framework with Iran is to the agreed framework with North Korea. It is also premised on this notion of sequencing, which is that they give a little, we give a little, and then theoretically they give a little more, and by that we all build confidence in each other. As you rightly said, I think that the evidence is pretty clear about North Korea. We gave a little, they gave nothing. We gave more, they still gave nothing, and by the end we were actually giving to get them to the table. We were giving them food and bribing the North Koreans just in order to get them to agree to come to the talks. And then they would take that and provide it to their military, and so we even had to stop that. So point well taken.
And I think, well, during the Bush administration, we had these arguments with the Bush administration. Democrats and Republicans were arguing with the administration. The administration was saying a small amount of sanctions relief was worth it to get a deal that would constrain its nuclear program. Unfortunately, had we listened, in my opinion, to Treasury at the time, talking to some of the defectors out of the missile program, they said when those sanctions have been deployed, they couldn't even get the hard currency to buy the, on the black market, to buy the gyroscopes that they needed for their missiles. I was going to ask Mr. Dubowitz about his comment about this limited sanctions relief and the argument that if you go down that road, the floodgates, as you said, could be opened in terms of the unraveling of existing sanctions, which serve right now to drive a lot of capital flight out of the country, to try to that serve right now to force the government of Iran to make some tough choices. Give me your assessment on that again in detail, if you would.
Thank you, Chairman Royce. First of all, I think there's a fundamental misunderstanding about sanctions. There's a lot of reference about the sanctions architecture, as somehow these sanctions are a house, and that we've got pieces of legislation with words on them, and that has created fear in the marketplace. Well, what's created fear in the marketplace has been the escalation of sanctions. It's the fear that every few months the administration is going to impose new sanctions through designations and executive orders, and every 6 to 12 months Congress is going to pass new sanctions, and it's going to create an economic minefield around Iran. And as a result of that, the administration hasn't had to actually sanction that many companies. If you look at the number of companies that have been penalized and the number of designations that have actually taken place, they're actually relatively few. And the reason for that is it's created fear. And fear is a great motivator in overcoming greed in the international marketplace. What we're talking about now with respect to sanctions relief, in its most general terms, is to actually stop that escalation, to actually de-escalate. And in de-escalating the sanctions, what we're doing is we're enticing international companies to test our resolve and to go back into Iran's lucrative energy sector, to start facilitating financial transactions, to start facilitating shipping, etc. There are companies who want to go back in. We've seen media reports of major energy companies who want to invest back in Iran, who want to buy more black market oil, and those companies are waiting to test our resolve.
Well, Dr. Call warns against pushing for what he terms a maximalist deal with Iran. Ms. Pletka notes that there are 6 binding resolutions of the UN Security Council demanding that Iran suspend all enrichment and all reprocessing activities. So the administration's approach would undercut these resolutions. Mr. Dubowitz, you note that the administration isn't even working towards a de minimis agreement. What are the conditions that we need to see put in place, in your opinion? And I'll close with that question.
Well, I think that the de minimis agreement, I mean, David Albright has actually come forward with an interesting de minimis proposal, a sort of bare minimum proposal. And one of the elements that I found most interesting in David's proposal is the requirement that Iran must freeze all centrifuge manufacturing immediately. It's important to understand that what the Iranians have been very adept at doing is creating nuclear facts on the ground, and that this reported Geneva deal would not terminate any centrifuge manufacturing. So what the Iranians could do in the next 6 months is they can build new centrifuges. They can build thousands of new centrifuges. And they can take those centrifuges, they can put them in inventory, they can wait until we get closer to a final deal. Then if a deal breaks apart, they're ready to install thousands of new centrifuges, which extends their breakout capacity. They can also take some of those centrifuges and they can hide them away in secret enrichment facilities. So one of the reasons this is a key deal term is this is absolutely critical to ensuring that Iran doesn't have secret enrichment facilities, which has been the fear of the intelligence community for many, many years. That's one element of a de minimis deal that reportedly was not part of the Geneva negotiations. I think that just as an overall response, Chairman Royce, we are at the high water mark of our negotiating leverage right now. And the fact that we even term our demands maximalist instead of the absolute bare minimum shows that from a negotiating point of view, the Iranians are willing to come in, negotiate with us, and bring our demands down. We should be insisting that enrichment is a minimum requirement, not a maximalist requirement, as Undersecretary Sherman said just a couple of months ago.
Mr. Engel.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. To me, one of the questions, and you've all talked about it a little bit, but I'd like to hear more about it. The question really hinges on whether we need an interim agreement, or should we just be negotiating a final agreement? Netanyahu has said that we shouldn't reach an interim deal with Iran where they only limit a part of their nuclear program in return for the relief of some sanctions. He argues that once you relieve the pressure on Iran, you'll never be able to turn it back up, and Iran will never take the necessary steps to eliminate their nuclear weapons program. The administration thinks, or said to me, they think an interim deal was necessary in which we pursue and even set back the Iranian program for 6 months. They say much about the fact that this will be the first time that the Iranian nuclear program would be slowed down. So the question I'd like to really ask is, do we need an interim deal, or should we just not, should we negotiate until we have a final deal? I'd like to ask each of you that. Mr. Dubowitz?
Well, look, the dangers of the interim framework is exactly what we're seeing, is that the Iranians are giving up de minimis nuclear concessions, and we are essentially unilaterally suspending the escalation of our sanctions. And in addition, we're offering real tangible hard currency sanctions relief. The dangers of an interim process is that the Iranians are going to enhance their nuclear negotiating leverage through facts on the ground, and we are going to diminish our economic leverage as companies become less fearful of U.S. sanctions and penalties, and as the web of sanctions begins to unwind. The architecture in legal terms may stay in place, but the absolute psychology may change. We may find ourselves in 6 months' time back at Geneva, where the Iranians have enhanced their negotiating leverage, we've undermined ours, and that final deal will not do what it was intended to do, which is to stop Iran's march to nuclear weapons capability. That's the danger of an interim framework. I think that's why we should be approaching these negotiations as an entire negotiation where everything is on the table while the Iranians continue to enrich and continue to construct their heavy water reactor and build new centrifuges. We need to be escalating our negotiating leverage through new and additional sanctions. Then let's put Khamenei to the test between a nuclear bomb and the survival of his economy.
Ms. Pletka?
What's most striking to me is how the nature of our negotiations has changed. We are negotiating on Iranian terms, and I think it's important to understand that when you think about the interim agreement. We've always characterized the battle in Iran as two timelines. The timeline in which our sanctions are effective in getting them to the table and giving up their program, and their race to a bomb. Essentially, what we are giving them by what we understand is the proposed offer that was given in Geneva is we are giving them the time to work on their program and the relief from the sanctions. So we're really giving on both sides while gaining almost nothing. There's another factor here. I was really struck by something Colin said, that we need a deal sooner because Iran is close. And if we don't do a deal sooner, if we have to look at a military option, they may well be at a point where they have a nuclear weapon. I mean, do we understand what leverage we have over time given the Iranians that he's just given away in this statement? That we better do a deal now, otherwise they're going to have a nuclear weapon? I mean, that's unconscionable. In addition, what are the Iranians proposing to give away? Something that before a year and a half ago they weren't doing, which is enriching to 20%. So the notion that we are somehow more skilled negotiators than the Iranians and that we're going to gain a trick on them by this interim step, to me, seems palpably false.
Let me ask Dr. Cole to answer, because I'm sure his answer will be a little different.
You probably suspect my view differs a little bit. Look, we have to have an interim deal, and the reason is we need the time. And we need the time for two reasons. First, the ultimate comprehensive deal, whatever its shape, maximalist, de minimis, whatever your terms are, is going to take a long time to negotiate. It's going to take 6 or 12 months. And that brings me to the second issue, which is Iran is making steady nuclear progress. Nobody denies that. The challenge is if you don't slow or halt or start to roll back their program, you're going to run out of negotiating room before they reach a critical threshold that would enable them to break out. So it's irresponsible, in my view, not to have an interim deal that effectively stops the clock so that you can negotiate the final deal. The alternative is that we basically play a game of chicken with the regime. We gamble on the notion that their regime will be brought into an existential crisis in the next 6 months, and that they will swerve. The problem is this is a regime that lasted for 8 years during the Iran-Iraq War, in which they lost 500,000 dead and experienced more than $500 billion in costs. They are not on the brink of extinction. They are not likely to cry uncle in the next 6 to 12 months, which means we need to buy time through an interim deal.
But Dr. Cole, let me just say this. Shouldn't we be saying to the Iranians, as long as we're negotiating, you don't enrich? Shouldn't we, at the minimum, sitting down with them, saying, I think that Mr. Dubowitz, Ms. Pletka mentioned this, there have been United Nations Security Council resolutions saying that Iran must abandon its enrichment. So why are we stepping back from those resolutions? Might not that be a way to buy time?
So I don't think the administration is actually stepping away. I think that the UN Security Council resolutions will have to be addressed during the period of negotiations. The question is whether you can get the Iranians to completely suspend their program now. They're unlikely to do it. For one thing, Rouhani agreed to do that in 2003 and believes that the West pocketed those concessions. He is not likely to make that mistake again. So we have to push for the UN Security Council resolutions to be addressed as part of the process of a final deal. But in terms of the interim deal, it doesn't need to be addressed. And I think it's important for the committee to understand this deal would stop 20% enrichment. It would eliminate or neutralize most of their 20% stockpile. It would stop new installations of centrifuges. Contrary to what Mark said, it would not allow them to stockpile new centrifuges. It would allow them to repair broken ones, but not stockpile them. And it has a meaningful solution for Iraq. It would halt the most troubling parts of the program for a period of time to negotiate an agreement that can address the UN Security Council resolutions.
Okay, I'm way over my time. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Ms. Ross-Layton, Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, history has shown us that our high hopes on Iran are misplaced and are always met with empty promises. The U.S. should only deal with Iran from a position of strength, and Iran senses weakness in our current approach. Iran is using the North Korea playbook until it realizes its ultimate objective. It took years for us to get sanctions in place that were strong and effective enough to bring Iran to the negotiation table. And now that the moment is upon us, we cannot falter. We must stay strong on sanctions. Yet at the first sign of this fairy tale progress, we balked. We offered Iran sanctions relief just for the opportunity to give them more time to complete its nuclear ambitions without any true enforcement mechanisms. And Dr. Call, you state that escalating sanctions now could weaken international pressure on Iran and that doing so would tie the hands of our diplomats. But if Iran came to the negotiation table because the impact that the sanctions are having on its economy, wouldn't continuing to pressure Iran bring it to the point where it would be forced to decide between total collapse of its economy or completion of its nuclear program? And I'll continue. The impact sanctions have had on Iran are obvious, but imagine how much more effective they could have been if we in the United States fully and forcefully implemented and enforced them 100% of the time with no waivers. That is not happening now. Ms. Pletka, you testified that you believe that Congress has not done its due diligence and that we have not forced the administration to enforce existing laws. I could not agree more with you. For over 10 years, administration after administration, I have been trying to remove waiver authority, have introduced and passed several sanctions bills, and constantly pushing for stronger and more comprehensive sanctions so that the true intent and impact of these laws can be felt. Do you believe that the lack of enforcement has weakened our hands at the negotiations and undermined sanctions? And finally, Mr. Dubowitz, you argue that core sanctions should remain in place but favor unfreezing certain Iranian assets. Wouldn't injecting funds into Iran's economy embolden the regime and alleviate the pressure, thus eliminating the only reason why it came to the negotiation table? We'll start with any of you. Ms. Pletka.
A lot of questions. Thank you, Congressman Ross-Lehtinen. You asked me about enforcement. What has always struck me about this problem, I came to the Hill in 1992, and we were working on the Iran-Iraq Non-Proliferation Act when I came. Sanctions are always a lagging indicator of the seriousness of the Iranian nuclear program, and that's the real problem. The closer they get, the more serious we are, but it is triggered by them, not by us. And I believe that the President has had the tools in his hand. I believe Bill Clinton had the tools in his hands in 1992 to begin to do the right thing. I think successive presidents have had additional tools in their hands and substantial pressure with the legislation. The problem really is that they've never wanted to enforce, and they've never wanted to lean, particularly on our allies. Colin is absolutely right. They didn't want that pressure. But what we see now at this 11th hour is that those sanctions made a difference. And
Thank
the
you.
problem
I'm gonna go
is
to
that
Mr.
new ones will
Dubowitz.
make a bigger difference.
Thank you.
Yeah. So the problem right now is that we've had a policy of all options are on the table. And now the President of the United States is taking all of those options off the table. He's taking the military option off because of the debacle in Syria, and because nobody, including Ali Khamenei, believes that the U.S. President will use military force to blow up his nuclear facilities. He's now asking the U.S. Congress to take sanctions off the table. So no military force, no sanctions, rely on diplomacy. Well, diplomacy without military threat and without sanctions is not coercive diplomacy. It's trust me diplomacy. And this is a regime that we cannot trust. By the way, this is a regime that has blinked many times in the past in response to significant U.S. pressure. The notion that this regime doesn't cry uncle is just not supported by the facts. Third is the idea of sanctions relief. If you're going to give sanctions relief, first thing you should do is take away all of Iran's money. They have over $80 billion in foreign exchange reserves. Quite a bit of that is accessible. Lock it all down through financial sanctions. Once you've locked it down, only then, if they take steps to verifiably dismantle their military nuclear program, should you begin to release some money. But don't give it back to Ali Khamenei and
So there's still
Rouhani.
so much that we can do.
Well, the fact of the matter is, don't give it back to the regime. Take it out of Chinese escrow accounts, put it in German escrow accounts
Thank
where the
you.
Iranians
Sorry,
like to go
Dr.
shopping.
I'm out of time.
And at the end of the day, snap it back when they cheat.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Brad Sherman of California.
Tough sanctions, at least tougher than we had before, brought Iran this far. They're clearly better now than they were 6 months ago. Why wouldn't the negotiations be more successful if the Senate were to pass the bill that this House passed by 400 votes? Why abandon the strategy that I think everybody agrees has forced Iran to at least change its image and its sound, to put sugar in its rhetoric, and according to the opponents of sanction, have caused Iran to improve its behavior? Dr. Call?
That's a good question. I don't think there's any doubt that the pressure of sanctions has brought the Iranians to the table. I think that it partly explains why Rouhani campaigned on the platform that he did, which was to improve the Iranian economy through an accommodation
So
with
if some
the West.
things
So-
working, why would you do less?
The point is, I think we have sufficient leverage, actually, to get the ball rolling towards a comprehensive deal. I think that's the leverage that the administration is trying to capitalize on. The sanctions relief they're talking about in the context of the Geneva Accord would be, I think, around $6 billion total of relief, and it would be temporary. It would not undermine the oil or financial sanctions that give us the leverage.
Dr. Cole, I want to go to the next witness, but I want to comment. You didn't give me a reason why we would do less, except to say that our current sanctions, which were not sufficient to get a deal good enough for the French, are somehow sufficient, but you didn't say why not to increase them. So I'll go to Mr.
I was about to say that, but if
I know, but they won't give me 10 minutes. Go ahead.
Look, the fact of the matter is there's too much focus again on how much are we offering at Geneva in terms of hard dollars. Is it $6 billion? Is it $20 billion? We can have that debate. I'm sure you'll see the briefings. The more important thing is the psychology of sanctions, Congressman Sherman. You've understood this over the years, and you've authored sanctions bills in this respect. You've got to change the fundamental psychology of the marketplace. It's motivated by greed and fear. When fear overrides greed, they stay out of Iran. When greed overrides fear, they go back into Iran. If you don't escalate sanctions through the passage of that Senate bill, then greed will override fear, and you'll be facing the dismantlement of the sanctions regime, which may be maintained on paper, but it won't be maintained in practice.
I'm going to ask all three witnesses to respond for the record. What specific elements should we have in the next sanctions bill that I hope comes before this committee, keeping in mind that we can't just wave a magic wand and get our allies to participate. We can't just say all money in Chinese banks has to be moved to German banks, otherwise, what, we won't accept any Chinese imports? I don't think we're to that point. So I'd ask you to craft not the perfect wish list, but the list of things that Congress could pass. And among the I hope you, I don't know if any of you have, you know, one silver bullet you want to share with us now, but I want all the bronze, silver, and gold bullets in your written response.
Well, there's no silver bullets. There are only silver shrapnel, and my testimony has 8 specific ideas. I would say the one piece of silver shrapnel that I think would really wound this regime economically is if you said that any financial institution that gives Iran access to or use of its overseas foreign exchange reserves would be cut off from the U.S. financial system, you would effectively freeze Iran's access to its money. And only then, once you've frozen all of its money, should we even be discussing sanctions relief.
Ms. Plitka? You have any silver bullets for it?
I have. There are no silver bullets. It's all about the perception of enforcement and momentum. Mark is exactly right. I've looked at sanctions on any number of countries and worked on them. It is the psychology of the global marketplace. And right now, the perception is that we are close to changing our mind and reversing momentum on Iran. And the Chinese are already back negotiating with the Iranians because they keep a close eye on this and they're interested in the market. So I think that the most important thing is to keep the administration and the Iranians' feet to the fire.
Okay. There are those who draw the red line where Iran gets one bomb. You're not really a nuclear power till you have several. You got to test one and have some. Without revealing, basing your answer on classified information, they've got enough 3% uranium, so if enriched to 90% would provide for how many bombs? And under this agreement, do they keep creating more and more 3%? Dr. Cull?
So they currently have enough 3.5% low-enriched uranium to produce about half a dozen nuclear weapons were they to decide to do so, a decision that our intelligence community says they haven't made. Under this agreement, my understanding, none of us know all the terms, but my understanding is they would actually be required to do certain things to their 3.5% stockpile that they would produce in this next 6 months to make it unavailable for nuclear weapons. And so it would
So they get to keep all they have now, and then the additional they create would be disabled in some way, Mr. Duberts?
Well, I don't have the details that Colin has, but if they maintain the 9,000 spinning centrifuges over 6 months, I believe the calculation that I've seen from David Albright is that they would produce almost a bomb's worth, another bomb's worth of 3.5%. So unless there are some details in the Geneva Agreement that prevent that I'm not aware of, that would allow them almost another bomb's worth over 6 months of negotiation.
So they get one bomb plus $6 to $50 billion. I think my time has expired.
That's just at 3.5%. That's not speaking of the 20% that they've been enriching for the last year. They have ample fissile material to make a nice arsenal of nuclear weapons in a quick time. And don't let anybody reassure you on the question of conversion to oxide. It takes about a week or two to convert back.
We're going to go to Mr. Chris Smith of New Jersey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for calling this important hearing. Thank you, for our witnesses, for your fine testimony. You know, in yet another sign of Iranian bad faith and wanton cruelty, American Christian pastor Saeed Abedini's situation has deteriorated significantly The Christian Post today has an article. It begins, Pastor Saeed Abedini has been placed in a single cell with 5 death row inmates in Rajay Shire prison and is prevented from having any visitors, the American Center for Law and Justice said, raising further concerns that officials placed him there to, quote, disappear. It's a murderer's jail, that jail, according to Jordan Sekalo from ACLJ. And again, the risk that he faces now is extraordinary. As I think many of you know, Congressman Wolf chaired a hearing, and I plan on doing one very shortly. But he chaired one, and we heard from Naghmeh, who made an impassioned plea for her husband. And it seems to me if there is a canary in the coal mine, it is the human rights issue. When a regime so horrifically mistreats people, in this case, an American citizen, and there are other Americans too who are being held, as well as many other indigenous Iranians who are being tortured because they espouse democracy or a particular religious belief, many of them being Christian. That also suggests how believable or not believable they are on the nuclear issue. You might want to, our witnesses speak to Abedini. Secondly, there was a report in the Daily Beast. The United States has done everything but stop blacklisting individuals and companies that Iran evade international sanctions since Rouhani's election on June 4th. And then Treasury says, we have not let up on vigorous sanctions enforcement one iota. Who's telling the truth? Can't have it both ways. Either we're truly enforcing vigorously or we have begun to back off very significantly. And finally, there is a report suggesting that China is purchasing its oil through a barter system to evade the sanctions regime, and including 40 joint infrastructure development purchases, capital equipment, technology, and materials to evade cash. Your thoughts on that? And finally, much of the focus has been on Iran's declining crude exports, oil exports. Less focus has been paid on the exports of fuel oils. Should that be part of a sanctions regime?
If I may address the first question about the human rights situation, this is one of the things I alluded to in my testimony, and I don't want to take up too much of the time. I know my colleagues have something to say on these other questions as well. But it is remarkable how much we have left on the table vis-a-vis Iran. I mean, think to yourself, okay, these negotiations in Geneva went better. The Iranians gave up more. We were all satisfied in an interim deal. Do we realize that we would be opening the door and relieving sanctions at the same time that the Iranians are abusing the rights of their own people? The population of Evin prison, in addition to the one you mentioned, the Baha'is, but set aside even the Iranian people. Let's say we don't care about them. What about Syria? What about Hezbollah? What about Hamas? What about Iranian interference in the Gulf? The day when we see Saudi Arabia and Israel banded together in opposition to our policy tells us that we've got something seriously wrong, and we have left all of that leverage on the table. That's a very serious area of pressure that we should be doing more on.
There are very few people more committed to sanctions enforcement than the U.S. Treasury Department and the Office of Terrorism and Financial Intelligence, but there's no doubt that before Rouhani's election, the pace of designations was rapidly increasing. After his election, it's been decreasing. And the reason for that is they get their marching orders from the White House. And it's been very clear that this administration, in order to grease the wheels for negotiation, has tried to offer essentially unilateral sanctions relief by slowing down designations, by blocking new sanctions in Congress, and by trying to lay the table for goodwill and confidence-building measures. So you're seeing that. In terms of oil, what we're seeing now, in fact, 150,000 to 200,000 barrels a day of black market oil is moving from Iran to other purchasers. This is a great example of an emerging loophole in our sanctions laws that the new Senate bill and the House bill you passed was designed to actually fill. And because we're not filling the loopholes, the Iranians are driving an oil tanker through it.
If I could just say one quick thing on the human rights issue, which I take very seriously. There's no question that this is a reprehensible regime in many respects. But it's also the case that throughout the Cold War, we repeatedly negotiated arms control agreements with the Soviet Union, which was at least as reprehensible as this regime. We don't have to make a choice. We should continue to force them, pressure them on human rights, on Syria, on terrorism, on other issues, but we shouldn't hold any of those hostage to the nuclear issue, which is a very urgent issue and very much in our interest and our allies' interest. So we can do both.
But very briefly, in American Abedini, Pastor Abedini, his situation has gone from horrific to even worse, and that is unconscionable.
Well, the rate of executions has accelerated under Rouhani, so I'm afraid it's going to get worse, not better.
We're going to go to Mr. Ted Deutsch of Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to continue to explore the details of the reported agreement. I know that Secretary Kerry is over in the Senate today briefing colleagues there, and reports are that Undersecretary Sherman and Cohen will brief the Senate Banking Committee again tomorrow. I hope that this committee will also be briefed on the specifics of the proposal in the appropriate location, the appropriate time, sooner rather than later. I'd like to just touch on the broader question of what the Iranians' intentions are with their nuclear program. And I'd like to move a bit beyond the back and forth over they want the right to enrich, there's no right to enrich, and take them at their word for a moment. And if the Iranians are truly committed to a peaceful nuclear program, how much, Dr. Call, let me ask you this question, how much low-enriched uranium would they need to operate the one reactor that exists in Iran?
The answer is under the current relationship they have with Russia, they don't need any low-enriched uranium because they get the fuel from Russia. That's right. The issue is, and the challenge for our negotiators is, that this is a regime that has spent between $100 and $200 billion on its nuclear infrastructure. And more importantly, its entire ideology is rooted around a resistance to arrogant external powers and the notion that their nuclear rights are inviolable. Now, I don't agree with that. And I suspect you don't either from your comments.
Right.
But we have to negotiate with the enemies we have, not the enemies we want.
I understand that, but we also have to acknowledge what the facts are surrounding the arguments made by the people sitting across the table. And I'd simply suggest that that there is, if we take them at their word, that in fact there's no desire for a nuclear weapon, they don't need any more, they don't need any enriched uranium, but understanding why they want to be able to enrich, why not come clean about the rest of the program? Why not respond to IAEA investigations of the possible military dimensions of the program, or the designs of triggers, or let inspectors into Parchin? Why not ship out the advanced centrifuges, since those aren't necessary for them to be able to enrich and have nuclear power? Why allow the construction of Iraq to continue for another 6 months, which puts us in a very dangerous position that lets Iraq get closer and closer to going online, even as we continue to negotiate? There was a report this morning that said Iraq would be capable of producing enough weapons-grade plutonium for one nuclear weapon per year. Why, as part of all this, instead of simply accepting the response that we sometimes get that we're not interested in nuclear weapons and there's a fatwa against nuclear weapons, why not, as part of these negotiations, as part of any deal, preliminary or final, why not have them respond to all of the allegations, the possible military dimensions that we all know about, that the international community is well aware of?
So I think proliferation scholars would say that what they're engaged in is a nuclear hedging strategy. That is, they are definitely trying to put all the pieces in place to develop nuclear weapons at some point in the future if the leader decides to do so.
Dr. Call, I'm sorry, no. But I'm not asking, I don't want to speculate. That's my point. I don't want to speculate. I don't want nuclear, no, let me just finish. I don't want nuclear scholars to speculate about what they may or may not be doing. If we're putting in place, if the goal is to put in place a deal, a diplomatic solution, which I support, if we can get to one that works, I think all of us do. If that's where we're trying to go, why not, as part of that, expect them to and require them to respond to all of the things that they've done that have caused us to pass sanctions legislation, bill after bill, over the years?
I think we should. I think that we shouldn't trust them. We shouldn't trust the fatwa or take them at their word. The entire purpose of negotiations is to put in place meaningful and verifiable constraints on their nuclear program to assure all of us that they'll never go for a nuclear weapon. That's the goal of diplomacy. The question, though, is, should we go all in on an optimal deal that's likely not achievable and could result in a collision and a war?
I understand.
Or should we go for a deal that's possible and also meets our national interests?
I understand, but I'm trying to get beyond. We've gone back and forth on that. I understand that that's the way any negotiation works. My question is, what seems to be missing, but I don't know. I don't know because it's not been confirmed. But what seems to be missing is that requirement that, look, if you want a deal, then at least come clean on all of these other aspects. Sit and tell us, respond to every question. Let us have full access to Parchin. Let us tell us what you've been doing that has prompted the IAEA to continue to point out the possible military aspects of your program. Why is that too much to ask?
It's not too much. I think in the final deal, the comprehensive deal that the administration wants to negotiate over the next 6 to 12 months, they would have to come clean on the past military dimensions of the program. And I should say, they are in ongoing negotiations with the IAEA on those facilities. So I know
why shouldn't they have to do that now, at the outset, as part of any preliminary deal?
Well, I think because the things that the initial deal has to address are the most urgent risks of a nuclear breakout. They're 20% material, they're advanced centrifuges, the loading of fuel assemblies into the Arak reactor, freezing centrifuge installation, putting in place more intrusive inspections in Fordo and Natanz, because I think the urgent aspects of the program have to be addressed first, and that's what the administration appears to be doing.
Okay, we go to Mr. Dana Rohrabacher of California.
Sorry, Doctor, but I just disagree with your somewhat positive analysis about where we are and where we're going. We are going in exactly the wrong direction with Iran right now. We're going exactly in the wrong direction in a lot of areas. This administration is rapidly becoming the epitome of failure from the top, because what we've got, these failures that we are discussing today, and the other failures that are plaguing the people of the United States from its own government, can be traced right back to the methodology that this president is using to exercise authority and power granted to him during the elections. We have, let me just finish, for example, my colleague, Mr. Smith, was noting that the Treasury Department reveals, and a review of the Treasury Department reveals, notices that the U.S. government has all but stopped the financial blacklisting of entities and people that help Iran evade international sanctions since the election of its president. Okay, so what we have here is that someone is offering waivers to what was the policy and the blacklisting of people who were evading international sanctions. This is something our government's supposed to be doing, but it's not doing it because of an intentional policy that was created where? And that later on in that article that my colleague Mr. Smith was reading, it states, like the waivers on Obamacare, the administration believes it is a law unto itself, end of quote. So what we have here is the President of the United States not following what would be the normal procedures of our government and coming up with failure, both domestically and internationally. I don't see any reason for hope at all in terms of things getting better about Iran. This last series of overly optimistic negotiations have left us with nothing but it appears to the world that we are weak. You know, going back to the Koreans, and this has happened before. It's not just this president, but other presidents have made these kind of mistakes and approach. But we gave food and oil to Korea, to North Korea, with the idea that was going to make it more likely that they were going to pull in and rein in their nuclear program. And what we ended up doing was subsidizing dictatorship, subsidizing a vicious dictatorship, and actually perhaps elongating its life. We are now talking about Iran, about the mullah regime in Iran. It would be the equivalent of a Hitlerite regime in the midst of the world, and it's about ready to obtain the ability of dropping nuclear bombs on countries and on people that it has targeted. This is a catastrophe if we let this happen, and it's been coming on, and this administration is making it worse. I do not see, as you stated, Doctor, I'm sorry, but we said we're buying time. We're not buying time, we're making a fool out of ourselves. We shouldn't, instead of being groveling to these people who murder their own people, I might add. The mullahs murder their own people. We can't expect them to treat the world in a different way. Well, while we're groveling, instead, we should be spending our time supporting those elements in Iran that are opposed to the mullah regime. They would get, very quickly, they'd get the word if all of a sudden the Azaris and the Baluch and the Kurds and the other people within Iran started receiving support from the outside on that type of pressure. Perhaps they understand. And I might add that this administration started off right in the very beginning refusing to condemn the slaughter of democracy seekers in the streets of Tehran who are protesting the mullah regime's stealing of the last election. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think I've made my point.
We go down to Mr. Brian Higgins.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, a lot's been discussed here about perception, but clearly the United States has an objective here, and that's the prevention of Iran having a nuclear weapon, not the containment of it after the fact. We cannot allow Iran's nuclear program to reach a breakout capability, meaning that Iran cannot have a civil nuclear program that allows them at a moment of their choosing to turn it into a nuclear weapon. You know, there's good news here and there's bad news. Iran is a country of 90 million people. Half the population is under the age of 25. And they're tech savvy. Social media is not on the side of the regime. Social media is used by Iranian youth not only for organizational purposes, but also for aspirational purposes. They can see how the rest of the world is living, and they ask the question, why not us? Organizationally, social media can be used for organizational purposes. What has the regime in Tehran been expert at? Suppression. Suppression. I suspect that sometime in 2014 you will see mass demonstrations on the streets of Tehran again because of the deplorable condition that the Iranian economy is in. They produce a lot of oil, but they don't have the capacity to refine that oil. So they export oil and then have to import gasoline because they lack that capacity. On a positive note, Hassan Rouhani won an election and there were only 6 candidates. He ran as a reform candidate. He ran against the policies that produced economic sanctions. He ran against the policies that produced international isolation. And once he became president, he said the economy was even worse than he originally thought it was. So the question is Iran serious about change? And can Rouhani negotiate a deal that he can deliver on? The backdrop to that, ironically, is that Rouhani was Iran's nuclear negotiator for 10 years. 10 years ago, Iran had 164 centrifuges, the big machines that enrich uranium. Today, Iran has 18,000 centrifuges, enough to allow Iran to make a bomb, to avoid detection, and to act before we can act against it. So while there are hopeful signs, there are also ominous signs as well. And while we're talking currently in the negotiations to destroy the Iranian atomic infrastructure, there's next generation infrastructure that's held within the knowledge of Iranian universities and laboratories, that even if we get a deal on the destruction, the next generation can be developed more quickly, the infrastructure itself, to facilitate the making of a bomb that much more quickly. So I will tell you that as Americans' interest in that in that region, particularly with respect to Israel, we have to not put our brakes on relative to sanctions, but accelerate, because only if there is internal pressure by the emerging youth that is better capable of challenging the regime and the deplorable state of the Iranian economy will the Iranians change it all. So I would just ask you to respond to those thoughts.
So I think you hit a very important point. Even completely dismantling their program, completely, doesn't prevent them from reconstituting it at some point in the future. They have the knowledge in their head. So the question is, if we're to prevent breakout along the lines you suggest, we need to maximize the amount of time it would take for them to build a bomb. We need to shrink the amount of time it would take for the international community to detect it so we could stop it if they moved in that direction. And we need to address the past military dimensions of their program along the way, along the roads that Congressman George mentioned. I think Rouhani is serious. I think he believes he has a public mandate. I think he believes he has some room for maneuver from the supreme leader. But I also think he believes he doesn't have all that much time, which is why I think he's anxiously pushing for a deal, and I think we're actually quite close on this first step deal leading to the final step deal. The challenge at the moment is that he has his own domestic political issues, and he's basically made the argument within the regime, give me a chance. Give me a chance, I'm going to negotiate seriously, I'll get a deal. And if we rush forward with sanctions now and appear hell-bent to increase sanctions regardless of Rouhani and Zarif's changed tone and their approach to the negotiations, it risks empowering the hardline voices inside Iran who will undermine his ability to get us to a mutual objective of cutting some kind of deal. I will also, my last point on the youth, I agree with you that the youth of Iran are extraordinarily important. I'm less confident than you are that our economic pressure would somehow mobilize hundreds of thousands of folks to take to the streets in Tehran. It's worth keeping in mind, every opinion poll and survey done in Iran for a decade has showed overwhelming support for Iran's nuclear program, including its enrichment activities. The likelihood that if we tried to force the regime to capitulate completely on its nuclear program, that would mobilize domestic political opinion, I think is just not borne out by the reality of public opinion in Iran.
Rouhani is going to be able to sell a deal. He'll sell a deal because from his perspective and from the Supreme Leader's perspective, it'll be a great deal.
Mr. Tom Marino of Pennsylvania.
Thank you, Chairman. Good afternoon. Good morning. Still morning. Thank you for being here. We're still dealing with the Iranian regime. And in the past, these people have proved themselves to be murderers and butchers, thugs and psychopaths. And clearly and repeatedly, they publicly articulate fanatical proclamations that all people who do not follow their absurd beliefs must be wiped off the face of the earth, including children. Now we're going to negotiate with these people? You are negotiating with terrorists that have funded and backed suicide bombers and murderous gangs, and now you want to reward them. Absurd at best. Iran has a different president, Rouhani, that's of course. However, don't forget that he's a puppet and still controlled by the supreme leader. So are you going to continue to capitulate? What in God's name do you think has changed the minds of these butchers? Dr. Call?
Well, I would point out that we need to negotiate with our enemies, not just our friends, and we have negotiated with regimes that are.
But we don't negotiate with terrorists. That has been a proclamation from the administrations since the 70s. And now we're going to turn that around and negotiate with terrorists. Have you considered at all, has this administration considered at all, Israel's plight in this? Who is the stability there? And it's a slap in the face to Israel, and it allows the Iranians to know that Now, Israel and the United States may not be as close as they are, which isn't true, and it shows a weakness on our part. How do you account for that?
Well, I obviously don't represent the administration. I'm not in the administration anymore. When I was there, I can tell you I did as much as any senior Pentagon official in recent history to support Israel's security, and I believe that every Israeli official I worked with would say the same thing. And I think that's not about me, it's about the Obama administration's commitment to Israel.
I disagree with you on this, that it shows that every person in that administration, regardless if you're there now or in the past, is very concerned about Israel. Just the move that we're making now, and I'm not holding you personally responsible for this. I disagree with many of the things that you have to say about what effect this is going to have, but what has happened to persuade you to think that these butchers are going to change their mind about whatever they do?
Actually, I'm not sure that they will. I think we need to test the possibility that they will, because, Congressman, what is the alternative? The alternative is we don't negotiate, we turn away from diplomacy, and do you know what there will be? There will be a war.
No, I don't agree with you. I do not agree with you. The alternative is going to be that there will be severe, more financial devastation to that country. The people, it's some of the people there, not many, are going to continue to uprise. And if they don't have the money, they cannot do anything.
But they're not anywhere close to that point.
Well, then we need to wait longer and make sure that they are closer to that point.
Congressman,
we should do what we did, what was done years ago in the 60s. Ignore what they're trying to pull over our eyes. If this administration does not understand, the president has changed his mind on this issue again. And as far as being a diplomat, as far as knowing what foreign policy is, he's way off base. And sir, I get so upset over the fact that he thinks, or this administration thinks, that if they put their arms around these terrorists, they're going to say, we're going to sing Kumbaya and everything's going to be fine. I just vehemently disagree with you.
With all due respect, I don't think that's their position. Look, we can't have it both ways. One cannot make the argument that Iran is on the brink of a nuclear weapon and also make the argument, which I'm hearing, which is we should just sanction them out of existence and wait until the regime falls. The timelines don't link up. There is no evidence, even if we did everything that Mark subscribed or everything that you passed in July or everything that the Senate is considering, that it will bring the regime to its knees in a time frame that prevents them from developing nuclear weapons.
Sir, you're comparing apples with oranges here, and you are basing your premise on the fact that the Iranians have changed an ideology of some sort, have at the very least realized that, well, these sanctions are hurting us and we have to do something before we're completely bankrupt. And so you and I can debate this all day long. I respect your opinions, but
Congressman, I would say it's a false choice. I mean, we're not passing sanctions to bring them to their knees and collapse their economy within 3 months. What we're trying to do is we're trying to pass sanctions in order to massively enhance American negotiating leverage so that we end up with a good deal that we, you, the administration, can sell to the American people. That's the goal.
Well, we have to be the ones that call the shots here, not the Iranians. I see my time has run out, and I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Marino. Mr. Connolly.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Gosh, when I hear statements like that seem to suggest this president is not a reliable supporter or friend of Israel, I think that would come as news to the president of Israel, who awarded this president one of the highest awards Israel has to give as a friend and supporter of Israel. But I'm also not sure where that last line of questioning was supposed to take us. I certainly can appreciate the frustration of my friend, but Dr. Cull, I mean, what are the choices here? If we choose not to negotiate with Iran, irrespective of what we think of the regime, what is the choice in front of us? What's the option if we choose not to negotiate with them because they're, quote, murderers and thugs, unquote?
The options are twofold. One, we could continue to escalate sanctions in the hopes of imposing regime change. I would say, you know, Mark has been a leading advocate of imposing economic sanctions not for the purposes of forcing them to capitulate on their nuclear program, but for regime change. He's written about that repeatedly. We could take that course. The problem is it's not going to work in a time frame that satisfies our interest of avoiding a nuclear weapon. Or we could strike their nuclear program militarily, or the Israelis could do it, in which case you would set the program back a few years. They would rebuild it on the back end of those strikes. It would cause instability in the interim. It would shatter the international coalition surrounding Iran. And they might emerge on the back end with a nuclear weapon anyway. So all I'm saying is diplomacy is hard. It's tough. It's going to take a while. And because it's going to take a while, we need to put some time on the clock, which is why we need an interim deal that leads to a comprehensive deal. Look, I don't like this option either, but it's better than every other alternative.
Well, that's a good question, and I see you, Mr. DeWitt. I'll give you a chance. Just 1 second. I think I hear some of the critics focusing on the suggested first phase interim negotiation as some kind of sellout that should be avoided at all costs. It's all or nothing. I think I hear you saying that that's not how it works, and that won't work, and we're going to have to be willing to provide some kind of first phase if we're ever going to get to an ultimate negotiated settlement that is to our liking and Israel's. Is that correct?
It's absolutely correct. I would make just 2 quick points. One, the initial deal that's being discussed in and of itself is a good deal in terms of addressing the most urgent parts of the program. And second, it is absolutely essential to get to the final deal. Look, nobody in the administration that I've spoken with or others have spoken with believe that this interim deal is the final deal. It's not. It's the first step towards the final deal. Winnie Sherman, Secretary Kerry, all of the rest see it that way, as does the President. We need to give it a shot.
Mr. DeWitt.
Well, the French, who are the guardians of nonproliferation, certainly didn't see it that way. So let's be very clear.
Didn't see it what way, Mr.
Well, they don't agree with that characterization, because at Geneva they insisted that that deal was not a good deal, and they refused to sign it.
Another way of saying that maybe is the French felt too much was given away or not enough was addressed on enrichment, for example, in phase 1 to satisfy them.
Correct, which is why it was a bad deal. The second issue is sanctions are designed to put in the supreme leader's mind that they will bring economic collapse. Not for regime change, not for provoking democracy demonstrations, but to put in his mind the fear that unless he concedes on his nuclear weapons program, he will lose his regime. Third of all, Colin has been a leading supporter of using military strikes as a verification and enforcement mechanism in a post-deal environment. In other words, we'll put in the safeguards regime, they'll sign the additional protocol, and then when they cheat, we'll use military strikes in order to actually get them to comply. Now, the fact of the matter is that is just not credible. And the Iranians engage in strategic incrementalism. When they cheat,
Mr. DeWitt,
right.
I only have 15. So what is it you think we should do, since that's not credible and you think it's a bad deal, phase 1?
Well, we got to get the best deal possible that doesn't allow Iran to retain the essential elements of enrichment and reprocessing that allow it to build a nuclear weapon, because no gold standard safeguards regime in the world is going to prevent a dedicated ideological regime that wants to pursue a nuclear weapon from doing so at the time of its choosing, unless you credibly think that the U.S. President is going to use military force as an enforcement mechanism for a verification regime. Colin seems to think so. I don't.
I'm down to 20 seconds. So what's the leverage we've got to get a better deal?
Well,
unless it's military strikes, or keeping the sanctions absolutely as is in place and maybe toughening them up.
The leverage is what the President of the United States has repeatedly said it was. All options are on the table. A credible threat of military force and crippling sanctions, in the words of former Secretary Clinton and the administration. Crippling sanctions, a credible threat of military force. If you take both options off the table, you don't have coercive diplomacy, you have discussions.
Thank you very much. We'll go to Mr. Brooks of Alabama.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. This hearing's premise is that there is something wrong with Iran obtaining nuclear weapons. My series of questions hope to elicit information on this point. First, if Iran continues to develop nuclear weapons at their current pace, in your best judgment, when is the soonest Iran will have a usable nuclear weapon? The soonest. Mr. Dubowitz?
Well, I believe that the estimates are that Iran is already in the position where it can actually weaponize uranium very quickly, in a matter of about a month. And so the real question then is, if it has the essential enriched uranium, weaponized uranium to build a bomb, how long will it take to design a warhead and a trigger and a delivery vehicle? And that,
that's what I asked. When will they have a usable nuclear weapon?
Right.
So how much time in your best judgment?
Well,
soonest?
The open reporting that I've seen is 2014, 2015.
Ms. Pletka?
I think that the problem that we're going to face answering your question is what you mean by a usable nuclear weapon. If you mean a dirty bomb, they could do it today. If you mean a rudimentary nuclear device that they could deliver in the back of a truck or a bus, a month. If you mean a weapon miniaturized on a delivery vehicle that works successfully, longer, probably a year, maybe even longer than that.
Dr. Call?
So our senior defense and intelligence officials have testified it would take them about a year to create a crude nuclear device. It would take them a few years to create a device that could fit on a missile. The long pole in the tent, though, is the fissile material, which all of us agree on.
All right, thank you. I just needed your time estimates, and I apologize for cutting you off, but I have 5 minutes, as everybody else does. In August 2011, I was part of a congressional delegation that met with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu in Jerusalem, wherein he unambiguously warned us that Israel will not allow Iran to have nuclear weapons, period, exclamation point. My question, what has Iran done or said that justifies Israel's concern? Mr. Dubowitz?
Well, let's see. They've threatened to wipe Israel off the map. Supreme Leader has called Israel a cancerous tumor. They've had a 20-year, at least, nuclear weapons program that everybody acknowledges has taken place. They've engaged in nuclear deception. And I think, as Congressman Deutsch pointed out, they've got essential nuclear elements that cannot be explained away for civilian purposes. And if it can be, then why aren't they explaining it away by coming clean on their past nuclear deception?
Thank you. Ms. Pletka, do you have anything you can add to that?
In addition to what Mark laid out, I think that what the Israelis look at is the willingness of the Iranian regime to arm proxy groups like Hezbollah, like Hamas, with increasingly sophisticated devices. And the better the Iranians get, the better the products that they're willing to supply to those groups. So we now see that Hezbollah has guided missiles, that Hamas has missiles that can reach Tel Aviv. What is to stop Iran eventually from sharing more information?
Dr. Call, is there anything that you can add to that?
I would just say that I think President Obama shares Netanyahu's view that it's unacceptable for them to get nuclear weapons, that it's a vital threat to us and a threat to Israel, and that the deal, getting the ball rolling on a diplomatic deal is aimed to precisely address those threats.
Has Iran done or said anything that should cause America to be concerned that Iranian nuclear weapons may be used to directly or indirectly, via terrorist surrogates, by way of example, attack American cities? Dr. Dubowitz?
Well, there's certainly open source reporting that the Iranians are building an intercontinental ballistic missile program. They don't need ICBMs to hit Tel Aviv or Jerusalem. They need ICBMs to hit the United States.
What about the distribution of nuclear weapons to terrorist groups who may try to smuggle them into America via our rather porous borders?
Look, it's an absolute nightmare scenario. I mean, they have close relationships with the most deadly terrorist organizations in the world that have killed Americans.
Ms. Pletka, do you have anything to add that might cause America to pause and be concerned about Iran's obtaining nuclear weapons?
Iran has invested an enormous amount of diplomatic, political, economic, and military effort into building its relationships in Latin America over the last few years. This committee has been very seized of that matter, and Mrs. Ross-Leighton has had a number of hearings on the question in the last few years. Venezuela, Nicaragua. In addition, Hezbollah has very substantial networks in Canada, we believe also in the United States.
Dr. Call, 10 seconds is all I have left.
Iran's a leading state sponsor of terrorism. It's worth noting, however, that they currently have chemical and biological weapons capabilities and have never passed those weapons to terrorists.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Brooks. Mr. Schneider of Illinois.
Thank you, and again, thank you to the witnesses for being here. I think it's important to reflect a bit why we are here and talking about the need to increase sanctions pressure, to have the negotiations to get to where we're going. I think on sanctions, and I will repeat what's become a mantra, that we need to increase the intensity of the bite. We have to accelerate the pace of acceleration. But to do so, as you said, Mr. Dubowitz, to leverage the ability we have in negotiations with the credible threat of force to ultimately achieve a permanent prevention of Iran acquiring nuclear weapons. That's what this is about. And as I think about it, let me posit some ideas of what have to be included in an agreement, a final agreement. And as I say, the first and foremost thing, we need Iran to come clean on their nuclear programs, halt and stop the weapons programs, and that would include Natanz, Fordo, Iraq, and Parchin, to understand what they have and any others that we aren't aware of. We have to not just have that halt, we have to have a reverse of their programs, a dismantling of Iraq, whether it's mothballing or removal, as you've touched on, of the centrifuges. But ultimately, we also have to have a permanent block or closure of the pathways Iran has, any pathways, both the uranium and the plutonium, to acquiring nuclear weapons. You, in your testimony, your submitted testimony, you talked about David Albright's irreducible minimums of what's required on those things, on the uranium pathway, on the plutonium pathway, the ability to acquire weapons. I'll open this to all of you. As you look at what's been reported from Geneva, do we achieve that first step, the halting, the freezing of anything? Do we achieve any of the movement that David Albright's calling for in his minimum requirements?
So my sense from the reporting is we achieve some of it, we don't achieve all of it. And remember, Dr. Albright's, it's called the irreducible minimum deal, but not for nothing. It's because all of those elements have to be there in order for it to be even a de minimis deal. So I think it's critical to understand that. I would also add to this, I mean, the Iranian regime have negotiators who are not only masters of nuclear deception, but they really know their file. I mean, they've forgotten tricks that our negotiators haven't even learned. And the key is they look for loopholes. You see that on the sanctions side, you see that on the nuclear physics side. They look for loopholes. They look for ways to reinterpret the Non-Proliferation Treaty. They look for ways to give on 20% and rope-a-dope us on 20% while still maintaining the ability to manufacture centrifuges and not to declare their centrifuge manufacturing facilities so they can build up those nuclear chips for those negotiations. We're dealing with people who understand loopholes. We've got to fill loopholes on the nuclear side, and we can't be fooling by loopholes on the nuclear side.
Dr. Call.
So I've had back and forth with David Albright on precisely this question, and this is Albright's analysis. If the deal stops 20% enrichment and neutralizes most of the stockpile, it doubles the estimated time that Albright has calculated for a breakout. That's not enough, but it's a step in the right direction. That is, it rolls back the program. If
6 weeks.
If the deal
6 weeks.
If the deal stops additional centrifuge installation and operation, that also prevents Iran in the next 6 months from shrinking the time in which it could use its stockpile to go for nuclear weapons. And if the deal stops them from making fuel assemblies for the Arak nuclear reactor, then they also can't bring that online. And if the deal increases inspections on facilities, it would be harder for them to cheat and not get detected. All of those things are actually quite good.
But Dr. Call, isn't it the case that Iran has already said they're delaying until 2014 bringing the Iraq reactor online? They'll still be doing construction of Iraq?
Yeah. So, no, that's a very good point, because I think there's a lot of confusion in the media about this. The agreement on the table, to include the one that existed before the French ever raised objections, would have been to prevent Iran from producing fuel assemblies. It's not just that they can't turn it on. They have to build the fuel assemblies at Esfahan to actually load them into the Arak reactor. If you prevent them from building any of those assemblies for the next 6 months, it's not like the day after the 6 months they can insert them all. They would then have to start the process of constructing the fuel assemblies all over again. So it isn't meaningful. The most meaningful aspect of construction for Arak that the Israelis are worried about and that we are worried about are the fuel assemblies and the deal deals.
Once those are in, we cannot destroy the reactor without
this
a
deal would
cataclysm.
push that. But this deal would push that way to the right.
But we're locked.
No, it would push
What I've heard is we're talking about 6 months. We don't have 6 months. It has to be a much shorter. As I think Mr. Dubitz, you were saying, it's 6 weeks is a time frame. How do we make sure that we bring, to your words, you said it's unclear if sanctions can bring a deal in time to prevent a breakout. How do we make sure that we continue to accelerate the pace, increase the intensity, and bring Iran to a decision point before they get to their final point of having a nuclear weapon?
Let me invoke David Albright one last time. They've been at the point for actually about a year where in a couple of months they could produce fissile material for a weapon. The reason why they haven't done that is that inspectors visit those facilities every week or two, which means they'd get caught. So I know 6 weeks doesn't sound like a long time, and I wish it was a lot longer, and we should push for a deal that makes it a lot longer. But the reality is that inspectors visit there every week or two, and the regime is not going to go for a bomb if it gets caught, because the reason is they don't want to get hit by the Israelis, by us, or anybody else.
But we need the sanctions to make sure they don't move forward. We have to increase the pressure, and we continue to negotiate so that we get to a place, in your words, that we have sanctions that get us to a place where we prevent them from having a bomb. I yield back.
All right, and I understand that come 12 o'clock, there are some flights out, and I know, Dr. Cawley, you had mentioned that you will have to catch a flight at that time, and we appreciate very much your testimony. Anytime you need to go, we understand because of your flight schedule. But we're going to go now to Mr. Ron DeSantis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank the witnesses. You know, this issue is frustrating because I remember when Rouhani was elected in Iran, I started reading about how he was a moderate. A lot of the Western press was very hopeful that this signaled a big change. But then as you look beneath the surface, I mean, a lot of this, I think the moderation is basically a function of differences in tactics and tone. And I think that he's smart to do that. Ahmadinejad said outrageous things because he meant outrageous things, and people at some point started to believe that he actually meant those things. So you look at this Iranian president, does he reject outright in the same way that the Holocaust happened like Ahmadinejad? No, not really. He says, well, look, people may have died, but I'm not a historian, is what he'll say. And he'll come to the West and offer soothing sounding platitudes. But looking beyond the surface of the words that he provides, this is somebody who, in my judgment, is very much in tune with the Iranian mullahs who are running that regime. I mean, even when he was running as a candidate, you know, he said saying death to America is easy. We need to express death to America with action. Last decade, he called Israel a terrorist nation. One of his defense minister was one of the plotters of the 1983 Marine barracks bombing in Beirut. September of this year, he said our government will not give up one iota of its absolute rights on the nuclear issues. He bragged about how he tricked the Europeans, essentially duping them to buy more time so that Iran would be able to convert uranium yellowcake. And of course, he was the head of Iran's National Security Council from 1989 to 2005. Of course, during that time, you had the bombing of the Jewish Cultural Center in Buenos Aires and the 1996 bombing of the Khobar Towers. And so I guess my concern is you know, I don't believe, I could see how some people, because of the sanctions, would see a need from an Iranian perspective to have a deal. But I just don't think somebody who is representing the regime's perspective would actually believe that foregoing a nuclear weapon would be in their interest as they define it in opposition to the United States and Israel. And so am I right to have this degree of skepticism about this particular president and of course, obviously, with the regime that ultimately controls him?
You know, in my testimony, I said that we were fortunate in our adversaries, and I think that was true under Ahmadinejad. He made it pretty easy to make the case that Iran was a menace. Rouhani is much cleverer, and I think that even internally he's going to handle things very skillfully. I think as Mark has said, and as many of the members of the committee have said, the issue here is whether we can change Iran's calculations. If Iran did not need to change its calculations, there should be no doubt in our minds that they wish to develop a nuclear weapons option, not necessarily a device, but certainly a breakout capability and an option. So can we change their calculus sufficiently in order to get them to delay it, understanding that that weapon is so debilitating to their ability to maintain domestic control and to keep the country economically afloat, that they're willing to put it off. That, at the end of the day, is the calculation. That is why, to me, the arguments that we should lessen sanctions seem so inapt, because that is what this is about.
And I would just add to that, I mean, again, it's not about Rouhani. It was not about Khatami. It's not even about Ahmadinejad. It's about the Supreme Leader of Iran, Ali Khamenei, okay, who is a man who has ruled that country with an iron fist, who has dedicated himself to building a nuclear weapon, who calls Israel a cancerous tumor, and who's basically funding an ICBM program to hit the United States of America, and who, by the way, tweeted out a few days ago, reportedly from his Twitter account, if we believe it's his Twitter account, a picture of the Iranian negotiators, and it said, these are not compromisers, these are children of the revolution. I mean, it's sort of very interesting. I mean, so what is he trying to tell us by that? Well, he's actually saying exactly what we fear, They are not compromisers. They will not compromise on Iran's nuclear ambitions. These are children of the revolution.
Which is
They are
why
ideologically committed.
Which is exactly why my skepticism remains, because from their perspective, getting involved in these negotiations, these fig leaves back and forth, that to me is just buying them time. If you're not going to have tough sanctions, if you're not going to have potential consequences that could change the calculus, I fear that they are going to proceed, and I think it will be much more difficult once they are successful in that regard. So I really appreciate your comments. I yield back. Thank you.
Okay, we're going to go to Mr. Series of New Jersey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for being here. I know it's late, and we're all here. And I heard just about every argument, but I come from a different perspective. I come from this perspective of how we negotiate. Here we have a country that just a couple of years ago was willing to blow up somebody here in Washington, D.C., fomenting all sorts of trouble throughout the world and terror. And all of a sudden, somebody blinked, and we're negotiating. And you had the president call him on the phone. I mean, the next thing is going to ask him to play golf or something. I really don't get the way you negotiate with this regime. I mean, they are nothing but trouble, liars, oppressing the people. Like you said before, there are more of assassinations in their country,
executions,
than ever before. Mm-hmm. So I don't understand how we, all of a sudden, are willing to just open the doors, negotiate, reduce the sanctions. I negotiated many contracts over many years, and the last person that the contract comes to is the leader. You send everybody else in, so you at the end, you can really get some of the things that you want in a negotiation. But to jump in from the beginning, I just wonder what you think of that. I mean, it's like, come on, you could make it a phone call, or it's ridiculous.
Congressman, we are negotiating with people who we like. I actually disagree. We're negotiating with people who we really like. We're negotiating with ourselves. We are negotiating with ourselves in Washington, D.C., and we're asking a fundamental question, and I don't want to, Colin's not here, so I don't want to put him on the spot.
So he can tell me,
but there's a temptation in this city, in approaching these kinds of seemingly intractable problems, to negotiate with ourselves and for us to deem what is reasonable. And then we take what is reasonable to the Iranians, and they have one word for it. Their word is no.
Absolutely.
And what they do, which is very adept, is they take, and Congressman Deutsch talked about this on the issue of enrichment. They say the right to enrichment is non-negotiable, non-negotiable. We will not negotiate over it. So we say, well, okay, I mean, we have our maximalist position on the right to enrichment, and they have their maximalist position, and then we'll negotiate. Well, the fact of the matter is, our maximalist position, as we so termed it, should be the minimum condition. It should be the one that the 5 UN Security Council resolutions stipulate. But we don't do that. We negotiate with ourselves. We come up with reasonable deals, and the Supreme Leader says no. And that's how the Iranian regime negotiates, which is why they're taking us and are going to take us to the cleaners. Right.
It's important to understand, as you underscore, that a negotiation remains a negotiation no matter what. The problem for us is the Iranians have dealt themselves a very nice set of cards and are constantly willing to hand off things to us that are facts, as you say, on the ground that they've created over the last couple of years. They weren't enriching to 20% before. Now, all of a sudden, they're willing to give it up at a time when we were demanding that they end all enrichment. We have not dealt ourselves a fine set of cards in the sense that every bad actor position that Iran has taken throughout the region, whether it's trying to assassinate the Saudi ambassador here in Washington, D.C., arming Hezbollah, what it's engaging in Syria, we haven't brought those things up. We haven't said, you know what, okay, we'll talk to you about these things if you talk to us about that. We have not negotiated this skillfully, and I don't believe that Secretary Kerry, I don't believe that Wendy Sherman, I don't believe any of these people are fools. And I don't believe that they want to do a bad deal. The problem is they want to do a deal more than the Iranians do.
To me, it just seems that if they sense in us that we're incompetent negotiating, or somehow that we are weak negotiating, they're just going to become tougher to negotiate with. They'll just keep adding and adding and make no concessions. To me, we should pass this bill that we have in the Senate, continue the pressure on this government, so somehow we can have a negotiation. Not that it will lead to what we eventually want, but I think we have to keep the pressure on this.
Keep all options on the table.
Absolutely.
As the President of the United States has said repeatedly, keep all options on the table. Don't unilaterally take them off the table.
But this business of like buddies on the, oh, come on. I mean, that's just ridiculous. I'm sorry. God. What were you going to say, Ms. Plachter? Were you going to add something?
Danny, do you want to say anything else?
Okay. Okay.
We go now to Mr. Ted Yoho of Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate you guys being here. You're doing a great job.
Will you forgive me? I need to step out. My daughter just hit her head. And
Absolutely. I understand completely.
This is about which witness is the last one standing.
That's right.
This is good.
I don't know if you win or lose, though.
I'm worried.
It just amazes me to hear what's going on right now in the present situation with these negotiations when we've always had a policy of non-negotiation. And the thing I like about this, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate you putting this together, is it's a bipartisan. Pretty much everybody's the same on this. Iran, what I've heard is they've got enough 3.5% uranium for 6 to 7 bombs. This is despite the international sanctions and also with what's been going on over the last 30 years. I mean, they've had a tough situation that we put a lot of pressure on there, not just us, but the world, and despite that, they're still doing this. And they've lied or misled, and they've just talked about the same thing over and over again. No, we're not doing this, but yet they have. And, you know, I remember those words of Ronald Reagan that says, trust but verify, but I feel Iran, and especially Mr. Rouhani, is lie, deny, deceive, but keep building. And that's what I've seen. And they're going to get a bomb, and then we're going to have to contend with that. And my concern is that they already have the material to do a dirty bomb, and with their association with the terrorists and the things they've done that just to hurt Americans and, you know, the destabilization of the Middle East, you know, I just see this getting worse and worse despite what we've done. And at a time where we've had these sanctions and they've done this would be not a time to back off. And I don't understand the administration's perspective of why they want to go in there and loosen these sanctions up. I agree with everybody else here. I think this is a time to put more sanctions in there, tougher sanctions. And I like the idea about dealing with the international markets, with the banking. I think that was you that brought up that. We can't dictate to anybody else, but we certainly can say, well, if you're dealing with those, we can freeze assets. And I think we also need to look at in the South Americas with Venezuela and Central America that are helping them stay afloat financially. And I'd just like to hear your thoughts on that. And I also like to hear your thoughts on, and you've already addressed this a little bit, is what state of the development of their ICBM program are they, and how soon, and do you think that'll be available, and what kind of numbers are you looking at?
So just on the ICBM, I'm not, obviously, I don't have access to classified intelligence on this, but I've seen open source reporting that the intelligence community believes that they may have ICBM capability by 2015. Mm-hmm. And in response to your other points, Congressman, I would just say this. I mean, let's not be under any illusions. We don't have crippling sanctions. We don't have them. We have sanctions that are painful. The Iranians are painfully muddling through. But they have more than sufficient foreign exchange resources to take themselves to critical nuclear capability, which is something that Colin was raising as a concern, and rightly so. But we haven't imposed crippling sanctions. So we've talked about it. The rhetoric has suggested that. We've had bills, we've had designations, we've had a lot of activity, but we haven't moved to crippling economic sanctions. And there's a way to do it, and we should do it, but we got to do it now.
I agree. I think that's what we need to do right now is put more pressure on them, because I think their willingness to come to the table or wanting to is maybe they are feeling a little bit of pain over there, and I think this is a time to tighten up the pressure on it.
And there's no credible military threat. I mean, let's not delude ourselves.
I agree.
There's no credible military threat. The Supreme Leader doesn't think that the administration is going to bomb these nuclear facilities, and this administration has done everything it can to box in the Israelis and undercut their credible military threat.
I agree on that, too.
So both have been taken off the table. You take it off the table, you no longer have coercion. When you don't have coercion, then you're going to enter a diplomatic game where even the French say, arrête.
Okay. Mr. Chairman, I'm going to yield back. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Yoho. We're going to go now to Lois Frankel of Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, I guess I'm running out of people to ask questions to. You know, listening to all this is really excruciating, because we all know that as we talk, Iran is not up to any good. So, let me just start out with what I think everybody here agrees is that an Iran with nuclear capabilities is bad. It's bad because it's a state sponsor of terror. It's a habitual human rights violator. It's directing Hezbollah's war in Syria. And something else, which I think we haven't mentioned, is that it would lead to uncontrolled nuclear proliferation in a very unstable region of the world. So we all agree with that. Iran cannot be allowed to have a nuclear weapon. So my first question, I have a series of questions. Let me ask them to you, and then you can answer in any order. One, do you think a diplomatic solution is ever possible? Number two, I'm assuming you do agree that this temporary agreement that's being suggested is not sufficient as a permanent deal. And so my next question, which I would have liked to give to Mr. Kale, was can you ever go back to a tougher stance once you seem to have a lesser stance? Is there any concern about a regime change for the worse if we do not go forward with this temporary arrangement? And then what do you suggest would be the next steps? And then when is enough enough? And
right. So I think those are great questions, Congresswoman. Look, I believe very strongly that there can be a diplomatic resolution of this nuclear crisis, and I think it can be done so through tough negotiating, through coercive diplomacy, through crippling sanctions and a credible threat of military force. That is the stated policy of the Obama administration. I think the danger that we've gotten into is we've decided to negotiate with this regime, and in doing so, and even before the negotiations, we set the table, but we set the table in a way that was advantageous to our opponent. We engaged in unilateral sanctions relief. I mean, unilateral sanctions relief. We took our leverage, our economic leverage, and we diminished it. We blocked new sanctions in the Senate. We diminished the pace of designations. And we sent a message to the world that, you know what, just wait, because pretty soon the architecture will remain, but the psychology will shift, and you can go back to business. Because if you go back to business, we're not going to sanction companies from Beijing to Berlin. Right? We're not going to sanction companies from Moscow to Paris. And that's a fundamental problem. So we've diminished our negotiating leverage as we've gone in. At the same time, on the deal side, right, what the Iranians are doing is through nuclear physics, they're enhancing their negotiating leverage. That's exactly what they did in Geneva. They're giving concessions that are increasingly less relevant to their nuclear weapons capability, like the 20%. The 20% has become increasingly less relevant because they've installed over 19,000 centrifuges, which is getting them a more and more rapid breakout capability. There are major loopholes in that Geneva proposal, as reported. It's the reason the French said no. Right? Those loopholes are being created at the negotiating table, and over the next 6 months, the Iranians will expand the loopholes, find other loopholes, and they'll do everything they can to get to Geneva in 6 months' time with increased nuclear negotiating leverage while having diminished our economic negotiating leverage, which is why I suggested to you earlier, I don't understand how we're going to get from a bad interim deal to a better final deal when this is the high water mark of American negotiating leverage.
Just to continue with some of those questions, I've heard the argument that if we don't do a temporary deal, that this could lead to a worse regime taking over in Iran. Have you heard that argument? And What would you say to that?
I've heard the argument, and I would say to you, I can't imagine a worse regime in Tehran. I mean, I don't foresee who's actually would replace Khamenei, the Revolutionary Guards, which has been a dictatorial regime. It's brutalized its own people, is a state sponsor of terrorism, and is devoted to building a nuclear weapons program, with anything worse. I mean, I don't see who is waiting in the wings. Now, who's waiting in the wings are not Jeffersonian Democrats, right? This is not going to be Canada. And speaking of Canada, I mean, this is interesting. So there are 34 countries in the world that have actually nuclear programs, right? You know, 19 of those countries actually don't buy nuclear fuel from abroad. Well, I should say they do buy nuclear fuel from abroad. They don't enrich and they don't reprocess them. One of them is Canada, right? And there's 14 European countries and South Korea and South Africa and others. And then there are a whole bunch of countries that do enrich and reprocess, of which 9 have nuclear weapons. And the 5 that don't have nuclear weapons, but enrich and reprocess, are actually Holland and Germany and Japan, Brazil and Argentina. And so here's the fundamental question for you on this issue of the regime. Are we negotiating with King Wilhelm of Holland or Ali Khamenei of Iran? And do we think when Ali Khamenei is gone, that there will be the new king of Iran who will be better? I think there will be. I think he will be better. I think when Ali Khamenei and this regime is gone, we will have a better regime in Tehran with whom we can negotiate a serious arms control and non-proliferation treaty, but not with this regime.
We're going to Mr. Scott Perry of Pennsylvania.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Dubowitz. You get the Stamina Prize. This is all, for me anyhow, this is all so predictable. I mean, you know, the great unwashed of us out there have been watching this for the better part of 20 years, and again, predictably, as Iran does the slow march towards their inevitable goal, and we keep talking and fiddling, so to speak. I wonder, and I'm disappointed that Dr. Kale has left, if he would agree with your assessment of strategic incrementalism, because that's what most of us have seen it. And unlike the enlightened class, again, to us, this seems somewhat inevitable. And I do want to make mention of your characterization of the negotiations with Iran, and I would characterize them as very similar to what happened in D.C. about a month ago, where we negotiated with ourselves on this side of the aisle, and the other side said no. I find that fascinating in this circumstance. But Dr. Kale talked about the pride that Iranian citizens have with their nuclear program. And I would like you, if you could, very quickly to quantify that, because what I don't know is with their nuclear program as a weaponized program for aggressive, proactive strikes, so to speak, as necessary, or a peaceful civilian nuclear program which produces power. Which one do they have an affinity for?
Well, it's actually a great question. I don't know what polls Dr. Kahl is referring to. The polls that I've seen actually don't draw the distinction. And so the question is, are you asking Iranians, do they support a civilian nuclear program, or do they support a nuclear weapons program? And furthermore, are you asking Iranians, if you get to choose between a nuclear weapons program and the collapse of your economy, which one do you choose? I haven't seen those poll results.
Right, so we're led to believe there's this false choice for Iranian citizens, who many are friendly with the United States, that they have to have this all-or-nothing proposition, and I don't necessarily agree or believe it's the case, and I appreciate your clarification. I do think that in this instance, because there's so much at stake, that negotiation is reasonable on this instance, because there has been a change in the top and the rhetoric has changed, and just to explore what the options are. But I am, as many Americans are, concerned about implications for the broader region and for our only true ally in the region, which is Israel, which has very much at stake to lose. So I ask you, what, other than the rhetoric, anything other than the rhetoric, has changed on the ground regarding the nuclear program and ambitions of Iran that should lead us to believe that we should change our position? Is there anything other than rhetoric, tangible?
Well, nothing's fundamentally changed in the rhetoric, I would argue. The nuances have changed. The nuclear physics have changed. Iran has advanced its program significantly. I think what's changed is that there is a sense now in Iran that they can't have their cake and eat it too. They can't have a nuclear weapons program and
let me redirect
and a buoyant economy, except for, sorry, just to finish, that was the choice. Unfortunately, the negotiations at Geneva are showing the Iranian regime that they can have a nuclear weapon and sanctions relief and a stabilized economy that gets the oil flowing. And then Supreme Leader Khamenei can do what he's always wanted to do. He wants to be a regional power. He doesn't want to be the Persian equivalent of North Korea.
My question, I guess, should have been very clear. What has changed for us? What would incentivize us? What would motivate us? I know what's changed for them. What's in it for us? Aren't they still buying time? Aren't they still enriching? Why don't we require them as a minimum standard to dismantle their military portion of it, knowing that they could enrich to very low levels and create power if they wanted to and have no military application? Shouldn't that be our minimum standard? What has changed in that calculation for America?
Congressman, nothing has changed.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. We go to Mr. Juan Vargas of California.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for putting on. I guess what I'd like to say is, Viva la France! Viva la France! Thank God for the French. They saved us on this one. I mean, it's unfortunate, no, but thank God for the French. Well, it's interesting how the French really stepped in and said, what are you guys doing? This is not enough. You can't trust this deal. And I completely agree with them. I mean, it seems to me that if you really want to get a deal, you've got to get the ultimate deal first. And that is, you have to agree, you, Iran, have to agree that you can't get a nuclear weapon, that you can't have the nuclear weapons program. Let's agree to that first. Agree to that. Then we'll agree to the interim program. Then we can talk about what we can do to get there. But agree with that first. But I don't think they'll ever agree to that, because I think that's what they want. I mean, it seems almost ludicrous to me to think that they want anything other than that. Their nuclear program is interesting because it actually began back in the 1950s, and the United States was the one that helped them. That was the Atoms for Peace program, I think it was called. We were the ones that first got involved with this nuclear program with the Iranians. And they wanted to develop energy, of course, and now it's taken on a very new dimension since the revolution there. And I think it's ludicrous for us to think that they're trying to do anything other than that with this program. And one of the things I was going to, and I do want you to talk about is this, because I don't think most Americans get this. When I talk to people about this, they say, well, you know, they need this fuel. That's why they're doing it. No, they don't. You mentioned 19 countries, but could you explain more specifically why they don't need to enrich to this level? Because many, many countries have nuclear programs, nuclear energy, and they don't do this.
Well, that's exactly right, Congressman. So there are 19 countries in the world that have civilian nuclear programs. They buy their nuclear fuel from abroad, and the economic assessments that I've seen actually demonstrate that it's more expensive for Iran to power a civilian nuclear program with its own domestic enrichment capability or plutonium reprocessing capability than it would be to buy nuclear fuel from abroad. So it doesn't make economic sense. It certainly hasn't made sense at all because they've been under punishing sanctions, right, that have really put severe stress on their economy, though those sanctions haven't been crippling enough to actually change their fundamental calculus. And so one wonders why they continue to persist in this program if this program is for civilian purposes. It makes no sense economically, it makes no sense politically, but it makes a whole lot of sense if your goal is to build a nuclear bomb and to have regional power and to achieve regional hegemony and to threaten your neighbors. Then it makes a lot of sense.
And that, to me, sounds absolutely obvious. Why would they allow themselves to go through these sanctions when they could very easily say tomorrow, you know what, we're going to give up this program. You know, we're going to give up this enrichment program. We're not going to weaponize. Instead, we just want peaceful nuclear energy. We just want nuclear energy to run the lights here in our country. They could do that tomorrow and not go through these sanctions that are they're not crippling, but are beginning to damage their economy.
Well, that's exactly right. And you'd also ask, well, why have you engaged in decades of nuclear deception? I mean, why haven't you come clean with the international community on these possible military dimensions of your program? Why have you lied? And since you've lied, how can we actually believe in your promises of transparency going forward? I mean, I gets back to this old issue of which we don't even talk about, at least I haven't heard this discussion. What does the safeguards regime look like? What does the verification and inspection regime look like post-deal? And by the way, when the Iranians engaged in strategic incrementalism, which is known as incremental cheating, what's our response going to be? So they don't let inspectors into Parchin 2, Parchin 3, and Parchin 4, okay? Or they block access to certain critical facilities where they're manufacturing centrifuges, et cetera, et cetera. What are we going to do as the United States of America to ensure those inspectors get to see what they want to see and that the Iranians are not engaging in cheating and diverting their enriched uranium for military purposes? I would contend to you, sir, that a lot of experts at that point will say to you, that's when we're going to use military force. And I would suggest to you as well that I find that very hard to believe.
I would too, especially where we are.
Not credible.
Especially where we are right now. That's why I think we have to get the ultimate deal first or no deal at all. Then you can negotiate the interim. But until we get there, I don't see how we can have any kind of meaningful deal that's verifiable, that's enforceable. So again, in light of that, I would say again, vive la France. Thank God for the French on this. At least they're open-eyed on this.
The French are the guardians of nonproliferation, and there's a great editorial in Le Monde today, which is the leading French newspaper. I would suggest all of you read it. Le Monde, I think, described this very, very carefully and accurately about why the French care so deeply about stopping Iran's march to nuclear weapons.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Vargas. We go now to Jeff Duncan of South Carolina.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding what a very timely and valuable hearing for the American people to watch and for us to participate in. Most of my questions were answered. I just don't want 2013 to resemble 1938. I don't want to reach a deal that is so weak that it will resemble the deal, the Munich Agreement, which Neville Chamberlain so aptly said, peace in our time is so remembered for an agreement which allowed Germany to continue its march to war unfettered. I do not want Iran to continue its march to a nuclear arsenal unfettered. Chinks in the armor. For centuries, enemies have looked for chinks in the armor. And I think when a presidential candidate says that he would sit down with a country like Iran, who Americans know are not sincere, they sit down with no preconditions. I think that begins the chink of the armor. I think when you have weak agreements, that you expand that chink and give the enemy an opportunity to get into the underbelly, the weak underbelly of a country. Mr. Rayo mentioned earlier our relationship with Israel, the United States relationship with Israel, and I think he said that it's never been stronger. But, you know, Israel's concerned about this to the point that they've come out strongly opposed to the Obama administration negotiations. In fact, Prime Minister Netanyahu tweeted on November the 7th this. He said in his tweet, "If the news from Geneva is true, this is the deal of the century for #Iran." And he went on to say Saudi Arabia has invested in Pakistan nuclear weapon projects with a potential ability to obtain atomic bombs at will. Israel's concerned, and they should be. Since June, when Rouhani was elected, Treasury has issued only 2 designation notices that identified 6 people and 4 companies violating the Iranian sanctions. The Obama administration has also opposed new Iran sanctions, the bipartisan legislation which has passed Congress. We have every right to be concerned. We have every right to hold these kind of hearings to raise awareness and address these issues. And I think the panelists have done a great job in really identifying the problems and the concerns that we all should have. So I want to shift gears, Mr. Dubowitz, and just ask you about the gold sanctions implementation just for a minute, because I had an amendment to a bill that came through this very committee which addressed the gold sanctions and specifically Turkey. Section 5A of Executive Order 13622 sanctions a person that has materially assisted, sponsored, or provided financial, material, or technological support for or goods or services in support of, among other items, the purchase or acquisition of U.S. banknotes or precious metals by the government of Iran. It's an executive order from the Obama administration. Given that any effort to evade or avoid the sanctions is a violation, how many people has the administration sanctioned under this executive order, to your knowledge?
To my knowledge, none.
Who specifically has the administration sanctioned for gold or related transactions with the government of Iran?
Well, sorry, that was the answer to my question.
None.
None, yeah.
Same answer, none.
Yeah.
So if we're not enforcing these kind of executive orders and these kind of sanctions, what kind of weight do they carry? And what signal does that send to the folks in the region?
Right. So on the gold issue, it's complicated, but it's instructive for the way forward. That executive order was in July of 2012. Between July 2012 and the July 1st of 2013, when the congressional gold sanctions came into effect, at the request of the administration, they were delayed, as you remember, by 180 days. Iran earned $6 billion worth of gold between July and July to add to its foreign exchange reserves. Now, since congressional sanctions have actually come into effect in July of this year, the gold sales to Iran have plummeted. They've come off a cliff. And the congressional sanctions have been actually very, very effective. Now, if we are now going to be offering gold sanctions relief as part of some interim measure, we estimate that gold relief could be worth about $9.6 billion over a 6-month period. And we get that because the height of the monthly gold sales that Iran was actually accessing last July was about 1.6 billion per month. So they were at about a monthly high of 1.6. If they get back to 1.6 with gold sanctions relief, that's 6 months at 1.6, that's 9.6, almost $10 billion worth of gold, which, by the way, is 50% of their total fully accessible foreign exchange reserves. So right now they only have $20 billion in fully accessible reserves. We're about to add $10 billion to the 20 and give them $30 billion in fully accessible reserves. That's the price of sanctions relief in exchange for incremental nuclear concessions that buy them economic runway and don't give us the opportunity to sufficiently block their nuclear physics runway.
It continues to buy them time.
$10 billion. That's a 50% increase in their fully accessible reserves.
And from what I hear you saying, the sanctions, the gold sanctions have worked. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. I thank the witnesses, too. I thank them for their testimony. And members, thank you for being here today. These are critical times for the national security of the United States. And as we've heard, central to these talks is the issue of uranium enrichment and reprocessing. These technologies can produce the explosive material needed for a nuclear bomb, and that's why multiple UN Security Council resolutions have reiterated the demand that all of Iran's enrichment activities, regardless of their purpose, must be suspended. 6 such resolutions. On this question, the world has spoken decisively, and on this question, I think our members of the committee have spoken too. This hearing is adjourned.